A Su-27 vaporized a Russian UAV headquarters in Luhansk in a single sortie. Minutes later, an FPV drone turned a hidden Buk M1 battery into a fireball. 2 pinpoint strikes severed the see and shoot chain behind the front lines and pushed Moscow's casualty toll to a new high. How does this breakthrough shake Russian strategy and shift the balance of the war? The Ukrainian-made Su-27 soaring over Luhansk was not just an aircraft. It was the steel-winged symbol of resistance in occupied territory. As of the morning of July 9th, the echoes of this Soviet-era fighter jet's precise strike on a target are still reverberating in operational footage. The mission was confirmed by intelligence sources as the destruction of a target, a temporary deployment site for a Russian military drone unit. According to signals received the previous day, a group of Orlan-10 operators, a mobile command vehicle, and several armored personnel carriers had positioned themselves in the area. The target was an old industrial building with a large roof. The structure was being used by Russian forces as a temporary headquarters and ammunition supply point. The flight plan was finalized throughout the night. The approach to the target was conducted at low altitude to minimize radar cross-section. The Su-27 was carrying 2 high-explosive FAB-250 unguided bombs. The bombs were to be released using a modernized navigation computer and external coordinate fixation. The pilot issued the arm command when the aircraft was 8 kilometers from the final target. The landing gear was retracted and the weapon systems were active. The radar warning receiver was silent. No effective air defense scan was detected in the area. The first bomb was then released. 2 seconds later, the second one followed. The maneuver began with a minimum descent angle of 20 degrees. As the Su-27 climbed, the sound of the explosion was clearly heard by ground stations. Observation drones recorded thick smoke rising from the east wing of the building within seconds. The main structure collapsed shortly thereafter. In the 40 seconds that followed, a second explosion occurred with the detonation of the ammunition stockpile. Thermal images showed that temperatures rose rapidly. The UAV unit was assessed to have been destroyed. According to radio intercept data, there was a brief communication outage in the area after the attack. At least 2 vehicles at the site were rendered unusable, and no evacuation or rescue calls were recorded for personnel inside. The Ukrainian Air Force issued the following statement after the attack. Specifically, our Su-27 successfully struck enemy unmanned aerial vehicles operating in the occupied territories in the Luhansk region and the gathering point of enemy forces. Although almost all of the Luhansk region is under occupation, the resistance continues. Our Air Force will continue to strengthen this resistance and not give the enemy any respite. This operation is significant in several respects. The first is the choice of target. Striking the area where the Russian Army's UAV command and control elements are located means not only physical losses, but also a blow to their observation and guidance capabilities. Timing and intelligence are also important. The attack was timed to coincide with a heavy concentration of personnel and equipment at the target. This shows that Ukraine's intelligence network of sensors and observation in the field is working effectively. The psychological impact is perhaps the most important aspect. The fact that Ukrainian jets are able to operate in a completely controlled area, such as Luhansk, undermines the Russian troops' sense of security. Although the Luhansk region is largely under Russian control, such precision air strikes demonstrate that Ukraine still has a deterrent and reachable force in the region. Immediately after the successful attack targeting UAV operators in Luhansk, precision strikes were also carried out against Russia's air defense infrastructure. The 413th Separate Unmanned Systems Battalion of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the 15th Artillery Reconnaissance Brigade, codenamed Black Forest, carried out a joint tactical operation to neutralize a Russian Buk M1 surface-to-air missile battery. The target of the attack was a Buk M1 mobile air defense system that was believed to have been on active duty shortly before. The vehicle had turned onto a forest road while attempting to leave the area after completing its mission. Due to increasing drone attacks, the Russian crew aimed to keep the system hidden among the trees, rather than leaving it in an open area to minimize its radar signature. But these kinds of maneuvers are no longer enough for Ukrainian reconnaissance systems. The operation, carried out with intelligence coordination, was executed in a three-stage plan. First, reconnaissance elements affiliated with the Black Forest Brigade clarified the coordinates of the Buk M1 through signal intersections and electro-optical analysis. Then, tactical drone systems from the Raid Battalion were directed to the identified location. In the second phase, an FPV-class attack UAV approaching the target locked onto the camouflaged Buk vehicle at an altitude of approximately 15 meters. The high-explosive penetrator warhead carried as payload was released to strike the center of the armor. After a brief silence, a violent explosion occurred as the warhead penetrated the hull. The explosive warheads of the missiles carried by the target vehicle also reacted in a chain reaction, causing a fire accompanied by intense smoke and heat that enveloped the area. Within a short time, uncontrolled flames engulfed both platforms of the vehicle, rendering it completely unusable.
For many years, Russia has proudly carried the label of one of the world's most diverse defense industries. Caliber cruise missiles, T-90 tank families, Su-34 bomber jets, and the now famous Lancet Shahed kamikaze drones. If you listen closely to the Kremlin's official rhetoric, all these systems are tied together under a single umbrella and flow onto the battlefield via production lines that are said to be uninterruptible. But the harsh Ukrainian moves that began in June 2025 and grew step by step until the end of July cut this chain in unexpected places. It didn't happen overnight. The Kiev team drew up a long-term plan, marked the weak links on the map, and stretched the range of unmanned aerial vehicles a little more each month. The result was a sudden stumble in defense production, the Putin administration's most valuable showcase. Let's make this clear. What we're talking about isn't the explosion of a single ammunition depot in a border town. What we are referring to is the successive shutdown of the nodes of a complex supply network that feeds the electronic brains of caliber missiles, the fluids that lubricate the pistons of T-90 tanks, the bombs of Su-34s, and the control cards of Shahed-derived kamikaze drones. That is why it is not an exaggeration to say that Putin's defense industry is collapsing. The figures you're about to see will concretely demonstrate how Russia has begun to count its ammunition. Here's the really important part. The drone attacks did not just blow up warehouses, they also shook the Russian central bank's plan to keep the ruble afloat. Let's break down the timeline step by step. The first attack on the Refinery complex, located approximately 40 kilometers from Moscow in the last week of June, served as a starting signal. The facility produced special hydraulic oils for the guidance valves of Caliber and Iskander missiles, Lancet servo motors, and engine bearing fluids for T-90 tanks. Annual production volume was 121 tons. One-third of this volume was allocated to ground forces, one-fourth to the missile air segment, and the remainder to civilian machinery. A Beaver U-type drone that penetrated the roof in the middle of the night ignited barrels filled with isopropyl, and the fire spread along the facility. The warehouse floor turned into a pile of metal within 30 minutes. The high heat melted the internal computers in the sensor calibration room. The impact of this attack on the front lines was faster than expected. The maintenance departments of Russian tank units serving in the Donetsk area reported a delay in the delivery of hydraulic fluid. By the end of the same week, 15% of the T-90 tanks deployed to the front via Belgorod were recalled for repairs. When the fluid required for the engine piston bearings was found to be missing, the tank's speed limits were reduced and body vibrations increased during firing. What seemed like a negligible chemical loss undermined both fire superiority and maneuverability in the field. At the same time, a psychological barrier was erected, as this was the first time an industrial facility so close to the Kremlin had been swallowed up. Let's now move on to Tambov. The nitrocellulose gunpowder reactor here was a modernized version of the basic ammunition concept from the Soviet era. It produced the propellant for a wide range of products, from artillery shells to MLRS rockets. 3 separate waves of Ukrainian UAVs struck the reactor's main boiler. The boiler was destroyed, and the plant immediately entered an emergency shutdown procedure. It was thought that production would be buffered by ready stocks, but reports indicated that gunpowder supplies to the front were delayed by around 30%. This reduced the intensity of Russian shelling on the Kharkiv-Liman line. When data from the field was combined with satellite images, the loss to Tambov became clear. The Russian rocket gun price index jumped 14% in a single day. The Kremlin intervened in state procurement contracts to suppress prices, but this move also plunged the facility into a damage control spiral. The third stop was the Cheboksary electronics plant in Chuvashia. The Cheboksary electronics factory supplied critical electronic components for Shahid-type kamikaze drones and Iskander missiles. Unmanned aerial vehicles reaching this facility, located 800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, have proven that no region of Russia is safe. This includes the safe zone designated in Russian defense plans. When the drone swarm penetrated the upper section, automation robots were disabled and assembly presses came to a halt. It is estimated that this disruption will require up to a month of repairs. The outcome is clear. The Shahid production line is already 4,000 units behind schedule. Field demands have collided with production plans. While the arrival of kits from Iran to the assembly hall in Yelabuga was already problematic, the malfunction of the card press will extend the delivery timeline by another 2 to 3 weeks. Why did Kiev specifically choose Cheboksary? Because this facility's lower production line manufactures a critical control unit known as the P500-based integrated chip, which has no Chinese equivalent. By targeting this chip, Ukraine aimed to slow down Russia's Shahid stockpile in terms of quality rather than quantity. When you put pressure on manned aircrafts, the JSC Progress plant in Michurinsk was another sensitive target. It is a small but sophisticated electronic facility. It was one of the country's rare technology bases producing guidance mechanisms for Russian artillery systems, aircraft autopilots, and missile control systems. Guidance kits for artillery shells are pressed here. Parts for the autopilot systems of Su-34 aircraft are also produced here. Components serving the gas and oil infrastructure were also produced here. The attack dealt a heavy blow to both the military and civilian industries. American sources reported that 1,800 tons of artillery ammunition were rendered unusable as a result of this attack alone, causing losses of approximately 8 billion rubles. However, the critical point is not the overall toll, but the precision strike capability. Without guided artillery shells, the Russian military is forced to revert to its old habits, namely the blind firing logic. Blind firing reduces damage per rocket, but increases ammunition consumption. As stockpiles already dwindle, a drop in accuracy will erode morale and logistics simultaneously. So far, we have mentioned 4 critical targets. However, the picture is not bright for the rest of the chain either. The Azot chemical plant in the Tula region was a critical link in the supply chain for military-grade explosives. Ukraine's attack on this facility directly increased the production pressure on artillery ammunition and led to a significant decline in stockpile levels. The production of explosive intermediates at the Azot chemical plant in Tula has been reduced to 50% of capacity for the time being. The Savazlayka airfield ammunition depot in the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast was not only a logistics facility, but also a base for MiG-31Ks. The drone attack on the depot disrupted the Air Force's readiness. It was reported that the flight tempo dropped significantly following the attack. The Kazan gunpowder factory was one of the key ammunition sources in Tatarstan. Explosive production at this facility was of vital importance for both ground forces and the Air Force. The attack was seen as part of a systematic effort to undermine Russia's ammunition backbone. The Sverdlov factory in Nizhny Novgorod was an advanced technology center producing warheads and components for anti-aircraft missiles. The success achieved there directly impacted Russia's production capacity for short-range defense systems. The Lipetsk II airbase was a strategic hub housing tactical attack aircraft such as the Su-34 and Su-35. The drone attack on the ammunition depot disrupted the ammunition rotation of combat aircraft, slowing down operational tempo. And perhaps the most symbolic target was the Yelabuga drone factory. This facility, where Iranian-made Shahed drones are manufactured, was the direct source of the systems used to attack Ukrainian cities during the war. Now let's take a step back and look at the macro impact of the entire list of attacks. In a matter of weeks, 10 vital factories in Russia were hit. These attacks are putting Russia's defense industry under pressure on three fronts. First, there is the direct loss of production. Second, there is the gap that emerges during the repair period. Third, there is the psychological and economic multiplier effect. The burning of resin it cuts, not only chemical oil stocks but also tanker logistics. The transport company is increasing its insurance premium by 20% due to the risk of flammable substances. This additional cost is not reflected in defense supplies, but even in the diesel bills of civilian truckers. The problem is that the Kremlin cannot compensate for this production shift with other lines. Extra shifts have been added in Kazan for gunpowder, but even there, infrastructure capacity is at 90% of national production. Some of the raw materials come from Belarus. As the destruction grows, the Belarusian line cannot keep up. Attempts are being made to source chemical components from India, but long shipping times and high reinsurance costs are driving up costs. China wants to be brought in for hydraulic oil, but Chinese manufacturers are demanding tough contract guarantees due to the possibility of secondary sanctions. For years, Russia has been telling itself the fairy tale of being a shield against the sky. The S-300 and S-400 missile batteries were the pride and joy of Kremlin propaganda. It was claimed they could even shoot down hypersonic missiles. That myth was shattered on the night of July 20th, 2025, on a rural stretch between Belgorod and Kursk. The Ukrainian General Staff summed it up in a few lines. The 91 N6E and 92 N6E radar stations stationed near the villages of Kolodny and Tepel have been destroyed. In other words, the brain of the Russian air defense pyramid was torn from its body. This does not look like a random bombardment. Rather, it looks like a categorical attack against high-value air defense resources, eliminating the direct retroactive effect of tactical targeting and instead directly shattering Russian air superiority in the region. Now let's analyze how this double blow was delivered, why Moscow couldn't respond, and which dominoes each lost radar toppled, from the front lines to the economy. Between February 2022 and July 2025, according to OSINT sources, the following elements were permanently taken out of service in the field. 18 S-400 radar/launch vehicles, 43 S-300 battery components. The cost is approximately $7.8 billion at current list prices. Almaz-Ante's annual production is a maximum of 9 complete sets, meaning that the 2 radars in July wiped out the factory's output for 6 months. Let's clarify the picture first. The 91N6E hit at the Kolodny coordinates acts like a National Geographic camera for an S-400 regiment. It scans everything within a 600-kilometer radius and writes targets into subcells. The multifunctional 92N6E radar, parked next to it, acts as a fire control system, guiding the missile from the moment it is fired until the last second. The Baz 69092 012 Voshchina 1 tow trucks pulling this duo also caught fire in the frame. The system lost not only its missiles but also its eyes and ears. The 92N6E is an extremely important radar system used by Russia to monitor vast areas of airspace and quickly detect threats. The S-400's 91N6E long-range reconnaissance radar performs wide-beam scanning and uses narrow filtering to improve the signal-to-noise ratio at low altitudes. If you have a target with an RCS, radar cross-section, of less than 0.05 square meters, the screen will be flooded with interference in milliseconds. HIMARS missiles, on the other hand, have a radar cross-section of less than 0.03 square meters. This is below the threshold value of the radar's automatic target detection algorithm. The operator can only select pixel spots by manually zooming in, at which point the alarm warnings will activate larger traces. Why is a small RCS so critical? While the radar's automatic filter threshold is 0.05 square meters, the GMLRS-ER rocket appears as 0.03 square meters. The warning time before the operator manually zooms in is less than 8 seconds. Considering the hydraulic antenna rotation speed and missile launch timing, this practically means insufficient reaction time. The Ukrainian army silenced a fully operational S-300 and S-400 battery along the Belgorod and Kursk lines in a single night using HIMARS missiles fired from border villages in the Kharkiv region. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirmed in an official statement that Ukraine's long-range air defense capabilities had successfully destroyed Russian S-300P systems and S-400 radar equipment. So how did Russia fail to see such an attack coming? The answer lies in the layered deception package that Ukraine has developed over the past 5 months. In the first layer, kamikaze FPV drones appeared in swarms 10 found 15 kilometers from the front line. They made noise, left electromagnetic traces, and essentially shouted, "I'm coming," to the radar. Russian air defense systems panicked, and Pantsir guns fired at low altitudes. In the second layer, old Soviet-made Tu-141 Strij reconnaissance drones flew at low altitude with cheap pyrotechnic capsules attached to their wings. They left a fairly large radar signature, but they were unarmored. The S-400 batteries had to waste their expensive 48 N6DM missiles on these shells. This depleted the battery's stock of ammunition and cooled the charging cycle, blocking the firing sequence. By the time the third layer came around, the night sky was silent. The Russian operators had already launched their missiles, and their search radars had been blinded by a swarm of bird drones. It was at this moment that the real punch came. Ukraine has been developing its out-of-range strike capability for a long time. There are many possibilities being discussed, but the strongest scenario coming out of Kiev is that Storm Shadow, Scalp EG, or modernized R-360 Neptune-derived cruise missiles were used. Additionally, analysts suggest that the operation depends on Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities, likely HIMARS or ATACMS systems, supplied by the West, and the weakening of targeting restrictions. A common feature of all these systems is their ability to fly at altitudes of 5 to 10 meters by scanning terrain, thereby reducing the risk of detection by using a radar altimeter INS guidance system instead of GPS. Russian radar systems are already blind to such a profile emerging from behind treetops. Moreover, in the terminal phase, the missile's warhead targets not a large radar mast, but the soft underbelly of a stationary tow truck. The impact point was chosen deliberately. Even if the radar antenna is not destroyed, the system will malfunction when the hydraulic power unit and generator are damaged. Don't think that when the radar is hit, only the battery in that village is silenced. The S-400 deployment doctrine resembles a 3-layered braid connected by data links. When one eye is lost, neighboring batteries also face the dilemma of send a missile, but who will see the target? This attack also hit an S-300PT stationed in another area on the Belgorod border on the same day. On the night of July 20th, one of the HIMARS M142s, which fired 6 tubes at once, used American-made GMLRS-ER missiles in actual combat for the first time. The standard M31A1 rocket has a range of 84 kilometers. The ER version, however, reaches 150 kilometers, thanks to high-energy composite fuel and an optimized nose cone. Russia's southern front plans were thrown into disarray by a single bombing order. The Ukrainian Air Force destroyed a vital border crossing in Zaporizhzhia, with JDAM-ER bombs dropped from MiG-29s. This crossing was not just a bridge, it was the military backbone connecting Crimea, Mariupol, and Dnipro. Now that backbone has been broken. Munition shipments have stopped, fuel convoys have been cut off. The Kremlin's summer offensive collapsed before it even began. Can Russia compensate for this setback? On July 7, a Ukrainian MiG-29 fighter jet targeted a vital Russian crossing point over the Karachukrak River in the Zaporizhzhia region. This bridge was no ordinary structure. Although not the main branch of the Dnipro River, it served as a key link in the Russian army's supply chain on the southern front. Heavy fuel tankers, trucks loaded with ammunition, and armored repair convoys regularly crossed this crossing every day, feeding the logistics line stretching from Tokmak to Melitopol, and from there to Crimea via Kinburn. This route, considered an alternative to the Kerch Bridge, was critical for the transfer of cargo to eastern ports in particular. In the spring, Russia built a temporary but structurally sound military bridge over the Karachukrak to reinforce this route. Supported by concrete slabs, this structure allowed heavy vehicles to safely cross the marshy ground. An average of 230 vehicles used this route daily, with 1/3 of them directly supplying ammunition to the front lines. The remaining transportation handled fuel and food logistics. This is precisely why Ukraine did not hesitate in its target selection. The attack was not a conventional air operation, but was carried out using 2 GBU-62 bombs, equipped with advanced JDAM-ER guidance kits. These bombs were modernized versions of the US-produced 1,000-pound Mk-83, Thanks to the GPS-guided kit added to the tail section and the deployed flaps, these bombs can reach a range of over 70 kilometers and hit targets with accuracy of just a few meters. Normally, Soviet-designed MiG-29s were not equipped with the necessary interface to use these bombs, but Ukraine introduced Western munitions to these aircraft with a special adaptation kit developed in Lviv. The pilot can now see the range and targeting data of NATO-inventoried smart weapons on the cockpit display. This transforms an old jet into a modern precision strike platform. As a result of the attack, the temporary military bridge was completely disabled. One of the factors that made the attack so effective was not only the precision of the munitions used, but also the systematic air defense suppression operation carried out prior to the operation. In particular, the Russian Army's Buk M1 medium-range air defense systems deployed in the region were disabled by successive suppression of enemy air defenses attacks in recent weeks. Despite having an effective radar lock range of up to 45 kilometers, these systems were either detected and destroyed or rendered blind due to their radar frequencies being jammed. As a result, Ukraine's MiG-29s were able to advance through an open-air corridor as they approached the range to launch JDAM-ER bombs. The second and less talked-about effect of the operation was not limited to the destruction of the bridge. This bridge was not just a crossing point, it also served as a buffer zone, masking the logistics hub of the Russian 35th Corps on the eastern bank. Hidden behind the fog of war, this staging area was now exposed and vulnerable. Satellite imagery and heat signature data indicate that smoke rose from 3 separate camp areas shortly after the attack. This likely indicates secondary explosions in ammunition or fuel depots. Following the attack, the eastern ramp of the bridge was completely collapsed into the sea, with concrete blocks blocking the inner roadway. This structural collapse not only stopped traffic, but also wiped Russia's critical supply route from Mariupol to Crimea off the map. They now have to detour from Tokmak to Berdyansk to reach the east of the Dnipro. But this new route means an additional 160 kilometers and a loss of time. Moreover, this secondary route is extremely unfavorable in terms of both geography and infrastructure. Consisting of a narrow strip of earth, this passage quickly turns to mud, especially during summer rains. In such conditions, heavy fuel trucks could get stuck on the road, with their wheels sinking into the mud. This is not merely a physical disruption, but a collapse of the logistics chain. Because the fuel needed to reach the tank's tank is being used to charge a satellite phone, used to call for a crane. On the military side, another panic has emerged. After the bridge was hit, Ukraine demonstrated that its long-range JDAM-ER munitions could easily strike the rear of the front lines, forcing the Russian Air Force to respond urgently. Su-30 SM fighter jets were moved to the vicinity of Melitopol, and day and night patrol flights were launched on the Vasilivka-Melitopol line. But these aircraft cannot fly above 4,000 meters to avoid entering the radar range of Ukraine's Patriot systems, which are equipped with AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles. This limits both their field of view and their attack position. There are patrol flights, but there is no real threat of a raid or suppression. The S-400 air defense batteries are scattered in a rather haphazard manner against this new threat. According to data obtained from satellite images, these batteries are mounted on temporary ramps that are constantly being moved rather than being placed in fixed positions. The aim is to prevent the destruction of all radar and command units with a single hit. This portability brings with it another problem. The radars cannot operate at the optimum altitude. In addition, Russian defense forces have deployed CRBN masking systems to make it more difficult for JDAM-ER munitions to target them. These systems reduce visibility by deflecting radar signals rather than suppressing them, but this appears to have seriously slowed down coordination and the chain of command on the ground. The impact of the attack has been much deeper and more multifaceted than meets the eye. With the bridge out of commission, the Russian command realized that it could not reinforce its front lines in Mariupol with BMP-3 armored vehicles, which were running on low fuel reserves. With the road link cut off, the solution shifted to air transport. The first reflex was to deploy Il-76 military transport aircraft. These flights via Kerch carried spare engine parts, sets of tracks, and emergency ammunition. But this method created two major problems. First, large targets such as the Il-76 are very easy to detect by Western radar systems, which means that the risk of air defense is immediately sky high. The second is economic. Each ton transported by Il-76 costs 3 times as much as the same load transported by truck. The cargo carried by Russia's logistics network on its southern front is no longer limited to ammunition and fuel. The Ministry of Agriculture's seasonal supply line from Donbass to Crimea has also been directly affected. Trucks traveling along this route transported grain, vegetables, meat products and milk to food warehouses in Crimea, returning with empty pallets, crates and waste packaging. But the destruction of the temporary bridge over the Karachakrak disrupted the two-way flow of this route. In particular, large refrigerated trailers are now forced to take a 160-kilometer detour via Berdyansk as an alternative route. Fuel consumption for trucks on this new route has nearly doubled. Logistics companies can no longer afford these extra costs. Many subcontractors have started to report losses. Civilian suppliers are directly sending invoices to the government, stating, "If prices on the shelves in Crimea do not increase by 18%, we cannot cover these costs." What moves could Russia make in response to the bridge's destruction? One of the most likely options is to disable the Patriot batteries in Ukraine. To do this, Moscow theoretically has Kh-59 air-to-surface missiles at its disposal. But in practice, things are not so simple. The US-Norwegian-made Nemesis electronic warfare system, deployed west of Kharkiv, confuses guided missiles such as the Kh-59 with GPS jamming signals it spreads across the field. These missiles need American satellite data to find their targets. But Nemesis distorts directional information, so the missiles often veer off into empty fields or are shot down before they can turn back. This means that the first option is systematically doomed to failure. The second option is to launch a salvo of Caliber NK missiles from the Black Sea Fleet at the Odessa-Bilhorod-Dnistrovsky line. The aim here is not a direct hit, but to put pressure on the Patriot system's radar and optical sensors. The missile threat would jam the radars and slow down the defense response. But this also looks stronger on paper. This is because Kaliber missiles are already assigned to more priority defense areas such as the Kerch Bridge, Novorossiysk, and Volgograd. Each Caliber missile is expensive and there are few of them. Therefore, rather than spending its Caliber stockpile to gain limited psychological superiority, the Kremlin is focused on shaping its defense against the JDAM-ER threat. Because what they have realized is that an American bomb can cause much more damage than a missile range test from the Soviet era. The Ukrainian side is preparing for the second phase immediately after the first strike. The number of MiG-29s carrying JDAM-ER munitions has now exceeded 18. Thanks to newly developed wing pylon adapters, each aircraft can carry 2 GBU-62 bombs in a single sortie. This creates an operational multiplier effect, more destruction with fewer flights. The target list has already been finalized. One option is the suspension towers of the Kerch Bridge. The other is the Mariupol railway viaduct. Both are of both symbolic and strategic importance. When the munitions payload reaches 2,000 pounds, the destruction threshold for such fixed structures is easily surpassed. Western experts are quite clear about this attack concept. This package, whether it's a radar tower or a bridge pier within range, will hit its target with pinpoint accuracy when the right coordination is in place. Ukraine, meanwhile, is preparing to use this precision to systematically dismantle Russia's logistics and transportation infrastructure. More interestingly, the question arises whether new JDAM-ERs will replace the existing stock. The Pentagon has committed to delivering an additional 900 units to Ukraine by the end of 2025. This means that Kiev now has not just a few munitions at its disposal, but the capacity to carry out a planned campaign. The calculation on the strategic table is as follows. If we strike one bridge per week, Kerch will be under psychological siege before summer ends. The targets on the map have already been marked. Alternative routes for armored convoys have been nearly eliminated. Russia's asphalt and railway network is being cornered further with each strike. On the countermeasure front, there is a plan being carried out in a hurry. Su-30 SM fighter jets are being integrated with Irkutsk-made Kibini-U electronic jammers. But there is a serious problem here. The software is not ready. The target date for the updated jammer software to be put into active service is the end of the year. Until then, the Russian military's fuel and ammunition transportation will have to race against the clock and navigate every millimeter like a minefield through the sunken passages of the Dnipro. The most notable balancing factor in Ukraine's latest bridge destruction attack is the new core structure of its air defense system, Patriot batteries. The US has quietly increased Ukraine's Patriot capacity to 3 batteries through shipments from Poland's Rzeszów Air Logistics Hub. 2 of these are the latest PAC-3 MSE variant, while the third is the GEM-T, which provides broader coverage. This combination provides not only point defense, but also sufficient range for regional threat suppression. Positioned to protect the Zaporizhzhia front, these systems create an electronic umbrella that provides maneuvering space for the Ukrainian Air Force. When MiG-29s carrying JDAM-ER take off from this Patriot coverage area and launch their munitions, an interesting tactical chain begins. The Russian side, seeking to intercept the launched JDAM, is forced to fire S-300/400 series SAM systems as a countermeasure. But the radar emissions and launch fire from these systems are directly visible on the Patriot radar image. When the S-400 comes into play, US-made PAC-3 missiles can instantly detect these threats. This tactic is known in military literature as forcing a stalemate. Ukraine is forcing Russian air defenses to make a decision, either fire the missile and risk being destroyed by the Patriot MSE, or remain silent and watch the strategic bridge collapse. The S-400 battery did not fire in this attack because if it had, it would have faced the risk of an out-of-range intercept, i.e. missile loss or a Patriot counterattack. Result: the bridge collapsed. This is a new nightmare for the Kremlin. Now it's not just about focusing on the target, they must also calculate the risk of exposing their systems, missile waste, and radar positions with every shot. Don't be surprised if new JDAM-ER images appear on your screens in the coming days, because every explosion destroys not just a target, but also a supply network that has been woven over weeks. Sometimes destroying a bridge is enough to immobilize an entire brigade. The Karachakrak Pass was precisely that breaking point. How do you think Moscow will compensate for this blow? Will it open a new transit route, bring its air defense forward, or pursue a completely different strategy? We look forward to your comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because in this war, a single GPS coordinate can change the fate of an entire front. Thank you for watching. The straight-line distance between Petropavlivka and the village of Kolodna in Belgorod is 142 kilometers. This means that the strike geometry is consistent. The missile's flight time is just over 6 minutes. It takes approximately 600 to 700 seconds to detect an object traveling at Mach 2 on radar. But the critical point here is not the path of the missiles, but what the radars see. Ukrainian forces also struck a Buk M1 radar system in the same area. This critically affected the performance of the radar system, while also reducing the operational effectiveness of the adjacent 5N66M Big Bird over-the-horizon radar station. The attack not only weakened the functionality of the S-300 and S-400, but also created a critical gap in Russia's air defense line. The Belgorod-Kursk arc was designed to keep any cruise missiles coming from the Ukrainian border away from Moscow's supply corridor. Now the northern part of the corridor has been pulled back. Kiev did not just bury the radar mast, it also opened a 10-kilometer gap in the air shield protecting Russia's military logistics trains. The Belgorod corridor is a supply bottleneck for Russia. Trains passing through here carry artillery shells, fuel, and even live animals to the Svatov front line. As soon as S-400 and S-300 surveillance is gone, Ukraine will have the opportunity to strike these lines with long-range cruise missiles such as Storm Shadow or Scalp, or with JDAMs. Russia did not want to take any risks and stopped train traffic for 3 days. Oil tank cars were parked in Suwalki, and steel plate shipments were redirected to Stary Oskol. If the internal logistics chain slows down by 6 hours, artillery fire on the front line slows down by 3 shells per minute. The material cost of the loss is also significant. The 91N6E radar tractor sensor package, priced at around $120 million in the 2021 catalogue, is a key component. Add 2 92N6E radars and 2 BAZ tractors, and the bill for the scrap metal from the accident, excluding fire damage, totals approximately $200 million. But the real value lies in the bottleneck in the production line. Almaz-Antey can produce a maximum of 8 to 9 complete S-400 sets per year. There is no replacement for the radar that has been rendered obsolete in the short term. They will have to make do with the old S-300V radars in reserve, which were designed in 1990, and whose signal processing architecture is not optimized for small target detection. Beyond that, there is a production bottleneck. Almaz-Antey's July report acknowledged that if it cannot obtain the Western DSP chips needed for the new radar unit, the delivery time will be extended to 18 months. As long as the sanctions remain in place, there is no solution other than temporarily patching the gap with SGTB or Buk M. Between February 2022 and July 2025, according to OSINT sources, the following elements will be permanently out of service in the field: 18 S-400 radar launch vehicles and 43 S-300 battery components. The cost is approximately $7.8 billion at current list prices. Almaz-Antey's annual production is a maximum of 9 complete sets. In other words, the 2 radars in July wiped out the factory's 6-month output. When 2 separate complexes collapsed in a single scenario, the Russian Defense Ministry began covering the S-400 launches in Crimea with tarpaulins the next day and dispersing personnel to a wider area. The chain of fear extended as far as the southern coast. New satellite images from the vicinity of Sevastopol showed launchers, which are normally arranged in an equilateral triangle, scattered 6 to 8 kilometers apart. Looking at the Russian air defense from the inside, 3 shortcomings emerge in response to the question, why can't we defend ourselves? 1. There is no artificial intelligence-supported classification software for filtering low RCS targets because although it was ordered, Western DSP chips did not arrive due to sanctions. Second, crew fatigue. Operators who have been waking up to alarms every week for 2 years are now exhausted from working in high alert mode. Turning the filter on and off while examining hundreds of false traces means missing the real threat, which creates psychological pressure. 3. Stock. At the beginning of 2024, the Russian army began using S-300/400 missiles in the field as air-to-ground rockets. As a result, the number of missiles needed to protect critical radars has been depleted. Normally, a battery has 32 ready-to-use missiles and 32 spare missiles. In the last 6 months, the same launchers fired ballistic missiles at Kiev and Kharkiv, leaving the countdown clock vulnerable to radar. Returning to the question of what weapons Ukraine used, both the geolocation data and the relatively fixed position of the targeted system reinforce the possibility of cruise missiles with GPS-INS navigation. The Storm Shadow's 450-kilogram warhead is enough to destroy a radar mast or towing vehicle in a single strike, and its range is around 250 kilometers. The Kursk coordinates are exactly this distance from the front line. Some defense analysts are also talking about the modernized R-360 Neptune Block II because this version was developed to cut air defense cables in the Black Sea and may now have been adapted to land target mode. On the other hand, the electronic attack element should not be overlooked. Independent researchers analyzing DW News frequency logs at the time of the attack recorded unusual wideband interference in the region. This suggests that G600M jammer pods accompanying the missile or a swarm of multi-engine decoy drones may have disrupted the S-400 data link. In terms of strategic consequences, Ukraine has tested its long-range strike capabilities. A missile that penetrates the Belgorod-Kursk line could reach the air bases in Tula, Ryazan, and even Kaluga, with a few extra fuel tanks. This possibility will spread and thin out the Kremlin's air defense line, creating new gaps in the center as it distributes the 10 batteries currently deployed around the capital to the country's periphery. The fear is not only military, but also diplomatic. 10 days later, Russian engineers did not show up for work at the Yelabuga facility, where Iranian-made Shahed drones are manufactured, citing high risk, and production was halted for the day. Kamikaze drones destined for the front lines were also delayed. In short, Ukraine killed several birds with one stone with this double blow. By dismantling the radar antenna, it made a dent in Moscow's psychological shield, ignited expensive missiles in stock, sent a message to the West that it had solved the range problem, and left the Kremlin condemned to a defense-offense dilemma. Approximately a quarter of the S-300/400 complexes are now out of service or in an inadequate configuration. This opens up a 200-kilometer land segment from Ukraine's western border as a cruise missile corridor. Every time Kiev exploits this gap, Russia's defense-offense decision cycle lengthens. Missiles remain in defense, stocks allocated for offense dwindle, budgets for missing radars expand, but the production chain hits the sanctions wall. Ultimately, the significance of the Belgorod-Kursk night lies not merely in the burning of 2 radar towers, it marks the first measurable breach of Russia's layered armor doctrine, a cornerstone of its air defense strategy, on the battlefield. As that fracture widens, the siren sounds a bit louder for every artillery battery, every logistics bridge, every ammunition depot on the front lines, now echoing in Moscow's ears. Russian planners now face a difficult equation. Should they produce the new S-400, or continue to use the remaining missiles as black cruise bombs on the front lines? Both options are resource-intensive, but it is now impossible to pursue both. And at this moment of indecision, every new step taken by Kiev began to appear on their radar screens as more than just static. Your defenses have been breached. The strategic core is next. Thank you for watching.
The destruction of the Buk M1 does not merely signify the elimination of a tactical target. This system remains one of the most advanced components of Russia's defense chain against low and medium altitude threats. This platform, which is specifically designed to counter kamikaze UAVs, cruise missiles, and low radar profile attack drones, represented Moscow's defensive reflex against Ukraine's growing drone capabilities. But with this attack, Russia has lost another of its limited number of modern air defense assets. Despite its advanced electronic systems, radar scanning equipment, and self-defense protocols, the Buk M1 once again proved vulnerable to low-altitude infiltrations. A system worth $10 million was rendered ineffective by a drone costing only a few $1,000s. So why is this attack significant? First deployed in the 1980s, the Buk M1 was designed to shoot down aircraft, helicopters, and even cruise missiles. But despite its multi-target capability and Soviet-era prestige, it is no match for modern UAV warfare. The destroyed unit joins a growing list. According to the Ukrainian Defense Forces, they have destroyed or neutralized 52 Russian Buk launchers, including 41 9A3 Tentimwaya-1T-O2 firing units and 11 9A39M1T2 carrier launchers. But Ukraine is not only targeting launchers. The radar systems that are the brains of these air defense systems are also being targeted. Ukrainian forces have so far disabled 13 9S-36 low-altitude target detection radars. 8 of these are from Buk M2 systems, and 5 are from the newer and more dangerous Buk M3 variant. Each radar taken down narrows the airspace around Russian forces and expands Ukraine's unmanned aerial vehicle corridor. Without these radars, the systems are effectively blind, and blind SAM systems cannot survive long in this war. This blindness leaves the Russian army vulnerable. Russia is taking the heaviest blows in terms of manpower. The numbers are so large they almost lose their meaning. Sources familiar with the matter estimate that Russia has lost over 31,000 soldiers this summer alone. To put this into perspective, the Soviet Union lost approximately 15,000 soldiers during its 10-year war in Afghanistan. Russia has managed to more than double that death toll in a single season. This is not just a grim statistic, it is a fundamental shift in the war. And it begs the billion-dollar question, why? What could possibly be worth this price? To understand what is happening, you need to look at Donbass, particularly around Donetsk. This is where Russia has decided to play its trump cards. The Kremlin's strategy, stripped of all propaganda, is frighteningly simple. It's a war of attrition. They believe they can afford to lose more people than Ukraine. The tactics on the ground seem to have come straight out of the history books of World War I, but with a horrific 21st century twist. First, Russian jets, mostly out of range of Ukraine's air defenses, launch huge gliding bombs to destroy Ukrainian defensive positions. Then comes relentless, devastating artillery fire, and then the people come. Russian infantry, often with minimal armored support, are ordered to advance in waves across open terrain. There's a reason they call it a meat attack. From the Kremlin's perspective, these men are a nearly infinite renewable resource, expendable in exchange for a few meters of scorched earth. The goal is not a brilliant tactical maneuver, it is to force Ukraine to expend its precious ammunition and reveal its positions, clearing the way for the next wave and the next. This is a strategy that is the product of a terrible calculation. The artillery shells that Ukraine has obtained from the West will run out before Russia's supply of soldiers. If Russia's strategy is a return to the 20th century, Ukraine's response is pure science fiction. They have built what analysts call a drone wall. Of course, this is not a physical wall. It is an invisible, terrifying, and ever-present dome of surveillance and death. Tens of thousands of cheap and adaptable unmanned aerial vehicles are constantly patrolling the skies above the front lines. You have unblinking reconnaissance drones in the sky that can spot a single soldier moving in a trench from miles away. The moment they see a Russian assault group forming, the coordinates are relayed. Then the killers arrive. These are FPV drones. Essentially, they are flying remotely controlled bombs. These agile, wasp-like devices, monitored from screens kilometers away by Ukrainian soldiers, can fly through the windows of abandoned buildings, dive directly into the open hatches of tanks, or chase individual soldiers across fields. They are cheap, costing only a few $100s each, and they are everywhere. This wall of unmanned aerial vehicles has turned no man's land into a death trap. It is so effective that Russian forces have been seen resorting to desperate, almost comical measures to send their soldiers to the front, including unarmored golf carts and dirt bikes, because their expensive tanks and armored personnel carriers are being systematically hunted down and destroyed as soon as they appear. This is where the story gets even more interesting. Russia had focused all its military might on the bloody and exhausting war in Donbass, leaving its own territory unprotected. The command structure became obsessed with a single goal: slow progress in the east. They failed to see the counterattack coming. Ukraine, with incredible audacity, launched a surprise cross-border attack on Russia's Kursk region. They did not have to face the best of the Russian army, because the best of the Russian army were busy dying in the Donetsk plains. The Ukrainian forces that crossed the border faced poorly equipped border guards and disorganized resistance from soldiers. This was not an attempt to conquer Russia. It was a brilliant strategic masterstroke. By panicking the Kremlin into withdrawing its elite units from Donbass to defend its own territory, it eased the immense pressure on Ukrainian defenders in the east. This was a classic example of martial arts philosophy. Using your opponent's immense weight and momentum against them turned the tide on the Ukrainian front lines. What happens when an army begins to disintegrate? An army can only sustain systematic losses up to a certain threshold. Commanders first try to patch up personnel shortages with temporary measures. When the number of volunteers dwindles, convicts are sent into the field, training periods are shortened, and reserve forces are rapidly sent to the front. But structural collapse progresses silently. First, inadequate training becomes apparent in combat. Then morale collapses, discipline slackens, and the chain of command begins to crack. Today, the Russian army is in the midst of this painful cycle. The Putin administration is trying to hide the real picture on the battlefield from the public. But the scale of the losses is now breaking through the walls of censorship. As the number of soldiers refusing to fight grows rapidly, Russia's independent media outlets report that disciplinary investigations and military court cases against these soldiers, known as odkazniki, have reached record levels. At the root of these rebellions is a sense of disappointment. Most of the troops are no longer adequately prepared soldiers, but civilians hastily sent to the front, reservists with little training, and convicts drafted into the army in exchange for amnesty. Since the beginning of the war, Russia's total casualties have reached nearly 1 million, and according to some sources, this threshold has already been exceeded. This statistic represents a stark reality that even the Kremlin's most powerful propaganda tools cannot hide forever. Across the country, empty chairs at dinner tables, newly dug graves in cemeteries, and the silent farewells of young men sent to the front without receiving their military discharge papers are all harbingers of traumas that will be remembered for generations. The summer of 2025 went down in history as a new threshold in this war. During this period, Russia launched a heavy offensive against Ukraine. The goal was to advance on the Donbass and southern fronts with a strategy of brute force. But this attack was not only the deadliest phase of the war, it also turned into a strategic failure. Far from collapsing, the Ukrainian army developed countermeasures thanks to renewed Western support, advanced UAV systems, and deep strike capabilities. It identified the Russian army's weak points and paralyzed its systems and command centers with precision strikes. At this point, the war has turned into a brutal race between Russian manpower and Ukraine's Western-backed technological capabilities. Drones, satellite intelligence, AI-assisted targeting systems, and long-range guided munitions are now the focus, directly at that heart. As refineries across the country are rocked by successive explosions, the red smoke rising into the sky is no longer just a threat to the Kremlin, but a harbinger of impending collapse. From Krasnodar to Ryazan, from Ilsky to Syzran, numerous strategic energy facilities have been struck, destroyed, or shut down. Like a giant whose energy arteries have been severed, Russia is slowly being engulfed in darkness. For the Russian people, it is now an ordinary night, defined by the sounds of drones, explosions, and the echoes of fire truck sirens. The sense of security has vanished. As refineries burn, the Kremlin remains silent, and the economy bleeds more each day. It is not just Russia that is on edge, the world is too. Because these fires are not merely a local crisis, they are erupting at the very heart of global energy balances. Now we take a closer look at the backstory of this rupture, the strategic implications of the attacks, and their global consequences. After nearly 4 months of silence, the Ukrainian armed forces have resumed targeting Russia's energy infrastructure. The Ilsky oil refinery in Krasnodar Krai was the target of a large-scale drone attack carried out during the night. Local sources reported several explosions, followed by a fireball illuminating the sky and the buzzing of drone engines echoing through the air. Shortly afterward, drone debris and thick plumes of smoke were seen rising from the facility's interior. The attack was indirectly confirmed by Ukraine's military intelligence unit, HSHR. The statement emphasized that the Ilsky refinery is not only a civilian energy center, but also a military asset providing logistical fuel support to Russian troops in the southern military district. This designation officially classifies the facility as a military target. What is known about the facility's strategic importance? The Ilsky oil refinery is one of the largest private refinery operations in southern Russia, with a processing capacity of over 6 million tons of crude oil per year. The facility is located in the town of Ilsky in the Seversky region and supplies products for both domestic consumption and international energy exports. Refined products such as diesel, gasoline, fuel oil, and bitumen are produced here. Most importantly, these products are transported to global markets via the Black Sea ports of Novorossiysk and Taman. However, in the context of the war, the facility has a more critical function. It directly supplies fuel to Russian troops stationed in occupied Ukrainian territories. This makes the facility not only an economic target, but also an indispensable link in Russia's fuel supply chain along the front lines. The technical aspects and impact of the attack also warrant attention. According to local media outlets and open-source news platforms like Exilanova, the targeted sections of the facility sustained significant damage. The fire that broke out after the explosion affected diesel production units and intermediate storage tanks in particular. Although not yet officially confirmed, it is believed that AI-supported UJ-26 Bober-type kamikaze UAVs were used in the attack. Emergency response teams were dispatched to the area, but extinguishing efforts continued for a long time due to high temperatures. Initial reports indicate that the diesel hydrocracking unit and 3 associated intermediate storage tanks were engulfed in flames, resulting in a loss of at least 30% of the facility's crude oil processing capacity. This 30% reduction represents the source of fuel for approximately 700 of the 2,400 tanker trucks that Russia sends to the front lines daily. When tanker traffic is disrupted, the fuel requirements of the armored vehicle column shift from Rostov to the Volga region. As a result, the supply line extends by 400 kilometers and becomes more vulnerable to drone attacks in open terrain. On the energy macro balance side, the production gap in Ilsky could have been filled by the Rostov-Novochakhtinsk and Samara-Syzran refineries. However, both have not yet returned to full capacity following the kamikaze drone attacks in March-February. The Kinev plant in Leningrad and the Rosneft facility in Ryazan are also continuing partial repairs following fires, leaving no surplus supply for southern military logistics. Since the beginning of the year, successive attacks have rendered a total of 26.5 million tons of refinery capacity unusable. This figure corresponds to approximately 15% of Russia's domestic diesel production and 1/5 of the high-sulfur fuel oil exports destined for export. For example, in March, the surplus of Urals oil that could not be sold to Europe was redirected to India, forcing an additional 330,000 barrels per day, according to Izvestia data. When facilities near the Black Sea port, such as Ilsky, are offline, shipments must be rerouted via the Ural River route to the Primorsk port in the Baltic. This results in a rise in freight costs from $2.50 per barrel to $4.10 per barrel, pushing the Urals-Brent price differential back to the $20 level. As the difference grows, the rubles entering the budget under the government's variable export tax formula on oil are eroding. The Ministry of Finance closed the first half of the year with an energy revenue shortfall of 1.2 trillion rubles, and this figure is expected to deepen in the second half. The hidden cost of refinery fires is not only lost barrels, but also increased insurance premiums. Following the March attacks, several major reinsurers covering Russian energy facilities raised their per-barrel risk premiums by 18%. The fire at Ilsky led to an additional 3 percentage points being added to premiums for 8 fuel terminals and pipeline exit stations in the Krasnodar region. The recurring series of fires has also cut off Moscow's access to foreign reinsurers.
Russia's Black Sea cities are in flames. Ukraine bombed Putin's valuable assets in Krasnodar and Sochi for the first time. Airports, refineries, and ammunition depots. But that wasn't the most striking part of the operation. Putin had once again launched a major attack on civilian targets in Odessa after the peace talks, but Ukraine immediately retaliated and took its revenge. So what did Putin lose with Ukraine's retaliation, and why did Ukraine strike this blow in Sochi? On July 24th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said, at a meeting in Istanbul yesterday, a proposal for an immediate and complete ceasefire was presented to the Russian side. In response, Russian drones are hitting residential buildings. For Kiev, this was a familiar pattern. The talks end, Odessa burns. Deputy Prime Minister Oleksiy Kuleba said that Russia launched 103 drones and 4 missiles in a nighttime attack, striking civilian infrastructure, including ports, transportation hubs, and residential areas. Ukraine then launched a larger retaliatory attack. On the night of July 24th, unmanned aerial vehicles attacked the cities of Sochi and Adler in Russia's Krasnodar region, and an oil depot near Sochi airport was hit. This was not just a simple drone attack, but a blow that destroyed Putin's tourism and oil economy in the Black Sea. The retaliation plan, coded as a counter-cost operation in the sensitive economic semicircle in the report of the Ukrainian General Staff, consisted of 23 unmanned aerial vehicles targeting the Sochi-Adler aviation fuel complex on the eastern slope of the Black Sea. The plan looked simple on the map. Take off from the Azov grey zone along the Azov coast, divert westward at sea level under the radar umbrella of the Crimean Peninsula, and climb towards Sochi's blind southeast radar sector over the Taman Peninsula. The actual operational technique went far beyond this. The 91N6E radar, stationed on the 40V6 mast, which Russian air defense had considered an angular lifeguard until now, kept its antenna in a fixed position facing northwest instead of the Black Sea, and therefore could not see the lower 50-meter layer used by the Boba-derived UAD-26s as they drew from the coast. Meanwhile, the thermal optics of the Pantsir S1 batteries mistook the fake heat masks added in September 2024 for real targets. The electronic warfare compartment was unable to prevent the Boba swarm from switching from dual satellite navigation to topographic matching. Ukraine's raid on Sochi was recorded at 23:07, according to official data from the Civil Aviation Agency, with an alarm sounding in the airport's approach area. Runway lights were dimmed, and 8 aircraft, 3 domestic and 5 charter, were forced to circle in the air. At 23:26, a warning was issued of an uncontrolled fire in the immediate vicinity. This was when the first of the Boba-type UAVs hit a row of fuel tankers north of the runway. Emergency officials in Russia's Black Sea region of Krasnodar confirmed drone attacks at the airport in the Adler district near Sochi. Flights were cancelled for hours. Sochi International Airport was closed between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. 97 flights were delayed in many cities across Russia. Passengers in Novosibirsk, Omsk and Tomsk were stranded, waiting for planes that could not land. The second wave of drones locked onto a refinery storage facility at 11:40 p.m. The most critical facility here was 2 large tanks storing RT-class jet fuel. If they caught fire, Sochi Airport would lose its continuous fuel buffer, and even after the runway was opened, it would not be possible to refuel the tankers. The Ukrainian General Staff spokesman confirmed this detail the next morning, saying, "The goal was not to target tourists, but to cut off the fuel supply." The head of the Sirius Federal District south of Sochi said a drone had hit an oil base, but did not provide further details. The Russian Aviation Authority reported that operations at Sochi Airport were suspended for about 4 hours. Dmitry Plishkin, head of the Sirius Federal District in Krasnodar Krai, said, "An attack was carried out on an oil depot on Tavricheskaya Street. Lukoil Yugnefta Produkt confirmed that its oil depot at 1/4 Tavricheskaya Street in Sochi had been hit. The storage farm at the port of Sochi is a strategic intermediate station that stores crude oil from the Kachinsky-Tuapse pipeline prior to loading onto sea tankers. This facility also supplies bunker fuel to passenger ships docking at the Sochi port and serves as an emergency fuel oil reserve for 4 thermal power plants in the region. The 2 large storage tanks that exploded had a total capacity of 36,000 cubic meters of jet fuel. The local emergency ministry sprayed firefighting foam around the tanks for 24 hours, but the heat of the fire, which exceeded 250 degrees Celsius, shrunk the metal of the tanks like lemon peel. According to an internal Rosneft report, it will take 10 days to safely remove the remaining fuel. And since the secondary tanks are also full, the Sochi-Tuapse tanker program has been suspended. According to leaked notes from Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, the main platform in the convoy was a new version of the UJ-26 Boba. An artificial intelligence module added to the previous variant automatically identifies radar antennas surrounding the target airport and recalculates the flight altitude that will provide the lowest radar cross-section twice per second. Link 16 was closed, meaning that instantaneous route updates were made without the need for allied data streams. When the thermal optics of the Russian Pantsir S-1 batteries failed to detect hot targets flying parallel to the sea, they were slow to lock onto the radar. The S-400's main search radar is mounted on a 40 V6 mast facing the coast, with a blind spot in the southeast sector. The Boba swarm climbed out of this blind sector. Technical summary. The fan scan angle on the defense line was not 100%, and Boba exploited this. This was the first time that open-source hardware and software support obtained by Kiev from Baykar, Edge Autonomics, and the Lithuanian-Estonian joint venture Skynetics was tested in the field in a scaled swarm configuration. The most frightening detail for Russia is the reduction of its dependence on global navigation. Boba still uses GPS, but even if the line is cut, it switches to an alternative using topographic matching. This puts the exchange rate risk of the ruble-yuan swap on Moscow's shoulders. At this point, let's take a look at which countries Russia is seeking support from. Iran is at the top of the list. Shahed bodies come from Iran. However, the actuator cards and telemetry modules required for assembly were manufactured in Russia. This balance was disrupted after the Cheboksary fire. The Kremlin offered Tehran to switch to complete box, ready-to-fly deliveries. The price discussed is around $100,000 per unit. Iran has a production line, but it is also depleting its drone stockpile amid regional tensions. Supply is limited. The second line is China. Chinese suppliers are being approached, particularly for synthetic motor oil and special machine bearings. However, fears of secondary sanctions are putting the brakes on this. Payment in rubles is being proposed to Chinese companies. The exchange rate risk is borne by the Kremlin. In addition, freight costs are skyrocketing as the logistics route extends the Siberian corridor. The third backdoor is North Korea. Pyongyang is demanding food and energy supplies from Russia in exchange for increasing capacity on its 152mm artillery shell production line. Korean shells comply with Soviet standards. However, South Korean intelligence is passing documents showing shipments to the United Nations, and the sanctions file is expanding. Each new sanction narrows Russia's currency swap options. India and Turkey are two pivots in the Kremlin's vision of neutral partners. Russia is offering India discounted crude oil in exchange for engineering equipment or financial swaps. New Delhi is not openly selling military parts, but it is leaving the door open for imports of intermediate chemicals and steel press molds. In return, India wants heavy discounts of the first 20 years to the journey over questions of his. Turkey is a transit bridge in terms of port logistics. However, Ankara does not want to remain in a grey area in terms of Western sanctions, so it divides trade into open and closed lines. Goods on the open line are very limited, while parts coming from the closed line require procedural games such as changing customs codes and trimming the origin. In other words, it is risky and expensive. All these concessions and dependencies cast a shadow over the great power narrative. Russia's bargaining power is diminishing as it is forced into a chain of regional alliances. China says, "We will send additional equipment, but you must reduce the price of natural gas." Iran is demanding, "If you want more Shahed drones, expand the Caspian oil swap." North Korea is responding with, "We'll give you artillery shells in exchange for food and technology." In short, the Kremlin is beginning to make economic concessions in exchange for strategic prestige. What is happening economically? The Russian economy is struggling to bear the costs of the war, and every disruption in the production chain creates an even greater burden. Production disruptions are continuing due to attacks on defense facilities. At the same time, drone attacks on rail and road lines transporting ammunition and fuel to the front are causing delays in transportation. These delays are increasing logistics costs and disrupting supplies to the front lines. The heightened risk perception in the war environment is driving up reinsurance premiums, i.e., insurance and reinsurance costs. Aircraft, trains and cargo ships are no longer considered normal assets, but are now classified as assets carrying military risk. This is causing transportation insurance premiums to skyrocket. At the same time, access to Western technology has been cut off by embargoes, forcing Russia to produce the parts it needs domestically. This increases import substitution. However, low productivity drives up costs. When all these factors come together, the picture is clear. The Russian economy's need for foreign currency and rubles is increasing. Under this pressure, defense spending is growing even more. Russia's military budget now accounts for 8.6% of its gross domestic product. But at the same time, the tax base is shrinking as the economy shrinks, the workforce is diverted to the war effort, and production capacity declines. State tax revenues are crumbling like sawdust. The central bank is intervening to prop up the hollowed-out ruble by selling foreign currency and raising interest rates. But the real economy is paying the price for these measures. High interest rates are multiplying the cost of credit for small and medium-sized enterprises and destroying the prospects for new investment. All of this has a knock-on effect that is felt directly in people's pockets. The Consumer Price Index announced in June rose by 2.4% on a monthly basis. When annualized, this rate shows that inflation has reached 45%. It is also necessary to mention the psychological dimension that these deep hit-and-run moves have created within Russia. The central bank is selling $100 million a day to support the ruble. As foreign exchange reserves dwindle, the institution is narrowing the repo window. The policy rate is 21%. SME loans are over 30%. High interest rates are curbing production, but inflation is not falling because the supply-side shock is not over. On one hand, the price of gunpowder. On the other, the price of motor oil. And on yet another, the price of truck insurance. All of these are reflected as price hikes on bread, eggs, and phones. Here is a critical statement. Russia's defense spending has exceeded 8.5% of GDP. Meanwhile, the economy is shrinking and the tax base is narrowing. State revenues are crumbling like sawdust. This contradiction is intriguing because historically, economies that allocate a third of their budget to military and security spending cannot remain stable for long. The Soviet Union of the 1980s is a case in point. The National Wealth Fund has long served as a crisis cushion. Now, as money in this oil-dependent fund dwindles, defense spending is reaching record levels. Financial circles are increasingly warning that liquid reserves could run out by the fall of 2025. In such a situation, the Kremlin faces a clear choice: either cut social spending even further or freeze the defense budget. Both options will create friction in domestic politics. Against this backdrop, passport queues are growing in Moscow. Young people working in the software, finance and engineering sectors in particular are under pressure to switch to a remote working model but leave the country. Passport applications increased by 190% in May-June. According to the Interior Ministry's database, 280,000 people left the country and did not return in the first 6 months of the year. While brain drain is directly eroding the tax base, the technology ecosystem is also being shaken. So why has Ukraine deepened this strategy? First, changing the balance of artillery ammunition on the front line now depends on cutting off deep logistics centers. Kiev's internal reports estimate that Russia is filling its border arsenals with 200,000 rounds of ammunition per month, but that if centers such as Tambov are destroyed, the speed of delivery will decrease by 35%. Second, when oil and chemical plants are hit, the effect on inflation is based on morale rather than the ruble. In the 3 days following the Rezonite fire, motor oil prices rose by 11% in major retail chains. If people pull their cars out of garages, logistics companies will struggle to find drivers, leading to a chain reaction of rising food prices. The economic shock is even more stark when viewed through the numbers on the table. The Russian National Wealth Fund is now pointing to serious difficulties. Financial sustainability, once the Kremlin's mantra, has given way to triage. The Ministry of Finance, which has been forced to revise its 2025 budget, now expects a deficit of 3.8 trillion rubles, more than the initial deficit of 1.17 trillion. Oil and gas revenues, the lifeblood of the Russian state, fell by 10% on an annual basis and collapsed by 34% in May alone. While this month's surprising rise in Ural's crude oil prices will bring some money into the fund, the NWF, once a symbol of prudence, still serves as a warning. The NWF's decline is not an isolated incident. It is at the heart of Russia's financial desperation. Russia's 2025 budget allocates a record $130.5 billion for defense, overshadowing all other priorities. Western sanctions have prevented Russia from borrowing abroad and forced it to deplete its own reserves. External debt dropped from $729 billion in 2023 to $293 billion in September 2024. Once a shield against foreign pressure, the NWF now stands as a monument to self-imposed isolation. Beyond all this, the economic devastation caused by Ukraine's attacks is also weighing heavily on Russia's shoulders. Not only on the military front, but also on the financial front, Moscow is bending a little more with each explosion. Ukraine's 10 strikes have exposed that the heart of the Russian war machine is actually being patched up with rotten patches. When the powder keg goes off, the gun falls silent. When the chip line burns, the missile goes blind. When the fuel tank explodes, the tank's piston seizes up. Will the Kremlin respond to this micro-lethal world with a macro-nuclear threat? Or will it recognize the unsustainable cost threshold and sit down at the negotiating table? The answer lies in how many gunpowder drums, electronic press lines, and barrels of weapon oil Moscow can keep operational by the same date next year. Because modern warfare is no longer measured in milestones, but in the precision of integrated circuits. And that precision is eroded with every drone buzz. Thank you for watching.
Forcing state-owned companies to adopt a conditional mandatory self-insurance model. The premiums transferred to the fund each month reduce the rubles allocated to the defense budget while delaying energy companies' investment plans. Gazprom Neft's $6 billion upstream expansion program for 2025 was reduced to $4.5 billion at the end of February, while Rosneft's $5.1 billion budget for drilling in Siberian fields was cut to $3.8 billion in the latest revision. On the one hand, the embargo is making it difficult to find technology and pipeline equipment, while on the other hand, refinery damage is reducing cash flow, forcing companies to slow down new drilling, which will lower production ceilings in the medium term. The decline in oil export volumes is also putting pressure on the ruble. When the Urals-Brent spread widens to $15, Russian barrels must be sold at a discount of over 12%. When the central bank sells foreign currency to banks to cover import bills, reserves are depleted. As of the beginning of July, gross foreign exchange and gold reserves stood at $500 billion. However, when the frozen G7 tranche and gold reserves are excluded, the real liquid buffer shrinks to $150 billion. Approximately one-fourth of this amount is used to service external debt payments due every 3 months. Investor demand for ruble bonds issued by the Treasury in the domestic market at the end of May was 40% lower than expected, with interest rates rising to 15.5%. High interest rates are making public spending more expensive, making it harder for Putin to maintain the balance of his 2025 defense social package. Fuel imbalances on the front lines are creating pressure to slow down the pace of ground operations. A motorized division consumes 350,000 liters of diesel fuel on a day of high-intensity combat. The 30% cut in fuel supplies to the front means that approximately 36,000 barrels of diesel fuel cannot be delivered, which theoretically amounts to the fuel quota for 12 motorized divisions, or 4 heavy armored corps. Filling this gap by transporting fuel by train from the Ufa and Omsk refineries doubles freight costs and extends the length of the rail line vulnerable to attack. Ukrainian railway sabotage teams have been sabotaging relay cabinets on the Kursk-Voronezh line since May. As the number of fuel wagons increases, so does the density of soft targets. Logistical strain is forcing Russian command centers to focus on rationing supplies and fuel rather than accelerating operational plans. As the speed of armored follow-up attacks on the ground slows, the time allocated for firing at batteries is shortening. The erosion of energy revenues is also shaking up the Kremlin's internal political equation. Russia's budget still relies on oil and gas taxes. The share of non-energy revenues is stuck at 38%. War spending accounts for 1/3 of total budget expenditures. When oil prices fall, this spending creates a financing gap. The Putin administration is turning to the National Wealth Fund to close the gap. However, the amount of liquid ruble-denominated foreign assets in the fund fell to $32 billion in February. Various bank reports suggest that the actual cash amount has fallen below even half of this figure. As the liquid buffer approaches a critical threshold, the Kremlin's ability to buy elite support narrows. Oligarch capital shifts from rubles to foreign currency. Capital outflows accelerate, the ruble weakens, and a vicious cycle begins. A $5 per barrel revenue shock alone creates a budget shortfall of hundreds of billions of rubles. This shortfall reached 700 billion rubles in the first half of the year. The Ministry of Economy hinted in its August revision that it would cut non-essential expenditures. Support for higher education, regional infrastructure projects, and even pension compensation increases are on the table. Such signals of social cuts are reminiscent of the mass discontent seen after the 2018 pension reform. The first reflex on the social front is to suppress fuel prices through administrative caps. The Energy Ministry's damper mechanism on retail diesel prices subsidizes the state refinery price difference. However, as refinery costs rise, the subsidy burden on the budget increases. By the end of 2024, the total amount spent on the damper mechanism had already approached 2.3 trillion rubles. Following the Ilsky fire, a new supply crunch in diesel is expected, which will require an additional 250-300 billion rubles in the second half of the year. This is a direct competitor to payments made to military industry subcontractors. As the state pushes to keep fuel prices low, it is squeezing the cash pool used to finance defense procurement expenditures. Domestic diesel shortages are triggering chain inflation in the agricultural sector. Krasnodar and Stavropol are Russia's grain silos. Harvesters require uninterrupted diesel fuel starting in August. Due to the Ilsky cutoff, queues are growing at regional stations. When the government imposed quotas on diesel exports, exporters' profits declined and farmers' costs increased. As grain prices rise, shelf prices in the flour bread pasta chain are increasing. Food inflation has a high weight in the CPI basket, so price hikes in the most sensitive items are fueling political tensions. The repercussions are also noticeable abroad. The Black Sea Mediterranean tanker route, which is the route Urals crude oil takes to India, is dependent on products originating from Ilsky. Following the fire, freight costs have risen, prompting Indian refineries to demand additional discounts. Russia's adherence to the lower prices as buyers decrease policy could widen the Urals discount margin, already down by $15 per barrel compared to the Brent basket to $18. Each dollar of discount translates to approximately $1.4 billion annual budget revenue loss. As cumulative losses grow, the economic patience threshold decreases. In addition to the military logistical dimension of the attacks, the strategic psychological aspect is also putting the Kremlin in a difficult position. The strike on a refinery after 4 months of silence sends a signal that Ukraine's intelligence strike pause strike again cycle is never ending. Even though Russian propaganda wants to suppress the narrative that our previous defense layers are protecting us, the flames that are reigniting in the eyes of the public are piercing the armor of trust. In cities where drone attacks reaching as far as Moscow are causing panic, even the first reports of gasoline station restrictions or multiple fires are triggering unnecessary mass exits and hoarding. This is precisely the psychology that a war economy does not want. Putin's leadership is becoming questionable under the effects of this energy logistics psychological triangle. The strongest pillars of his leadership image were stability and development. While maintaining wage and pension increases with a budget dependent on oil revenues, military modernization served the propaganda of a double victory. Now the same oil is hostage to a cycle of attack, fire, and reduced revenue. When the shrinking treasury must choose between armored supplies and social payments, every cut will erode social loyalty toward Putin. The oligarch class, meanwhile, may drift away from the desire to maintain support for the Moscow core indefinitely, when income declines are compounded by political risk. Historically, the collapse of oil revenues in the late 1980s drained the Soviet budget and quickly exhausted Gorbachev's room for maneuver. From Ukraine's perspective, this refinery assault chain is a strategic investment requiring patience. Field reports indicate that the body engine cost of the UJ-26 Bober kamikaze aircraft used in the attacks remains in the $90,000 $100,000 range. That is 1/10 of the cost of a Rafale or F-16 sortie. Even the most optimistic budget loss caused by the Ilsky attack amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars. As the asymmetric return ratio grows in Ukraine's favor, Russia's protective umbrella in the defense industry is turning into a more expensive, more necessary, but more permeable shell. The only conclusion that can be drawn from this is that Russia is rapidly heading toward economic collapse. Moreover, this situation is also acknowledged by Russian officials. Yes, we are currently calming down based on the numbers, said Maxim Reshetnikov at the St. Petersburg Universal Finance Forum. Based on current trade assumptions, it seems to me that we are on the brink of a transition to stagnation. As if that weren't enough to dampen morale, the head of the Russian central bank also echoed the pessimistic sentiment. Elvira Nabiulina said, "We have been growing at a reasonable rate for a long time because we have been using free labor resources. However, we need to understand that many of these resources have been depleted. We need to think about a show that has hardly been used for growth." Additionally, German Gref, head of Sberbank, the state-owned giant bank, made the following statement during the meeting. "We are facing a number of problems that can be described as a storm that has reached its peak." In other words, Russia is facing a critical economic downturn for the first time since the start of the full-scale war. Despite this bleak picture, Vladimir Putin does not appear to intend to change his war strategy. According to official Russian sources, the number of soldiers killed or seriously wounded has approached 1 million. This figure is not merely a tactical failure, but also indicates the systematic depletion of human resources in a war that has turned into one of the bloodiest campaigns of the modern era. However, this picture is not a reason for the Kremlin to halt its efforts. On the contrary, it has become a justification for even greater investment. According to the 2025 budget plans, the Russian Federation government intends to allocate a total of 13.1 trillion rubles for defense and security expenditures. This amount accounts for 6.3% of Russia's gross domestic product and represents a level not seen since the final years of the Soviet Union. This clearly demonstrates that economic priorities have been almost entirely redefined according to military needs, with sectors such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure being pushed to the back burner. A significant portion of Russia's massive budget is allocated to ensuring a steady supply of human resources for the front lines, producing new generation armored vehicles, artillery systems, and missiles, replenishing and repairing high-cost air defense systems, developing unmanned aerial vehicle technology and enhancing electronic warfare capabilities, and funding internal security agencies such as the Rosgvardia, FSB, and prison service. Additionally, it is observed that the Kremlin is increasingly integrating civilian sectors into war logistics. Civilian workers are being redirected to tank production facilities like Uralvagonzavod, and in some regions, university graduates are being directly employed in military production facilities. However, the sustainability of these increasing expenditure items is seriously questioned in the long term. The significant restrictions on foreign technology transfers due to Western sanctions have increased dependence on black market supply chains for critical electronic and engine components. Meanwhile, substitution issues in arms production have revealed that many products are being replaced with lower quality versions. According to assessments by the International Finance Institute and independent Russian economists, such massive military expenditures are deepening the annual budget deficit and forcing the central bank to continuously print money. Despite all this data, Vladimir Putin's message to the public is clear. Russia may delay its definition of victory, but it will not deviate from its path. This resolve is not only military, but also ideological and political. In the Kremlin's eyes, this war is a struggle for survival that will redefine Russia's place in the world order. However, the approaching death toll of 1 million, the depletion of educated officers, the destruction of armored units, and the relentless internal uprisings on the front lines indicate that this determination has now become a strategic burden. All indicators show that Putin is mobilizing all remaining resources of Russian society to keep the war machine alive. However, the burning of Ilsky is more than just a refinery fire visible to the naked eye. It creates a mosaic of echoes extending from frontline supplies to national accounting, from international price mathematics to the Kremlin's political balance of power. Every needle stuck into the energy artery does not merely cause the loss of a few barrels of oil. It leads to a strategic anemia that weakens the state's maneuvering muscles. In an equation where this anemia deepens, maintaining the reflexes of leadership will become increasingly difficult because the front line is no longer at the border. It is burning right in the middle of Putin's
Kaliningrad, Moscow's armored fist turned toward the west, the center of years of pressure along the Baltic front. But now, for the first time, this strategic region has become NATO's primary target. The defensive posture is giving way to a preemptive and swift offensive plan. Moreover, this operation could be a showdown measured not in days but in hours. Why has NATO moved now? And how could this region be brought under control? US, European and African Commander General Christopher Donahue made a clear statement that silenced the audience at the Aspen Security Forum in Colorado Springs when the Baltic issue was raised. We can isolate the area around Kaliningrad within hours with the forces we currently have at our disposal and bring it under control in a matter of days. This is a speed that was not possible in the past. Donahue continued. Artillery, precision fires, sustainment, airborne lift, all are ready to work in real-time synchronization. NATO has prioritized deterrence up to this point, but if the line is crossed, we are not limited to pushing back. Donohue's statement was not a casual evening remark. NATO has redesigned its Baltic frontline posture starting in 2024. The US has deployed a fleet of F-35As to its Branowo base in Poland. Germany has amassed elements of its 10th Panzer Division in Radviliskis, Lithuania, under the guise of joint exercises. Norway's multi-role MRC Typhoon land-based ballistic missile batteries, deployed to Gotland Island via Sweden, and the new NASAMS 3 block components donated to the Estonia-Latvia-Lithuania trio were quietly completed. During the same period, the project to transition to the NATO rail gauge of 1,435 mm on railway lines extending from Poland to the Baltic Sea accelerated. Adaptation stations operated even at night. HIMARS artillery pods were stacked at Lithuanian depot sites via Romania. Once the General Staff had prepared the main course balance, all that was missing was someone to present it at the table. Donohue did exactly that. The capacity of the Russian garrison in Kaliningrad remains significant on paper. Approximately 20,000 personnel, under the 18th Guards Mechanized Corps, comprising the 152nd Artillery Brigade with 3 battalions, form the backbone of the ground forces. At the Baltiisk port, there is a Steregushi corvette and 2 Boyan M missile ships, an Iskander M division in Chernyakovsk, the 689th Avierbase Su-30 SM squadron in the air, and the Bastion P coastal defense system on the shore. With the addition of 3 S-400 and 2 S-300 V4 batteries, the scene appears to an outside observer as a formidable A2AD fortress. However, satellite data reveals a growing list of flaws. Each S-400 battery should normally have 6 of its 8 launchers operational. In a series of photos taken by Maxar since the end of 2024, 3 launchers appear ready, while 2 are empty and 1 is under maintenance. The Iskander division should have a full complement of 28 launchers with 2 launch battalions. Currently, 18 launchers are active, with 8 located behind the barracks. The ships in Baltisk, meanwhile, can only make a monthly sortie, due to radar repairs and insufficient personnel rotation. So, the castle walls appear high, but the bricks are missing. The Suwalki corridor is where the strings are being pulled. The 100-kilometer plain stretching from the Polish town of Suwalki to the Lithuanian city of Mariampole is the only corridor through which Russia could open a land bridge to Kaliningrad via Belarus. For years it was referred to as NATO's weakest link. Now the tables are turning. Germany has deployed the 10th Panzer Division to Lithuania for training and exercises under the VJTF, while Poland's 16th Mechanized Armored Division is standing by at the southern end. According to the scenario, the 2 brigades will simultaneously move east-west to cut off the route. This blockade does not stop at sabotaging the railway. It also aims to jam mobile phone signals, disrupt Russian unmanned aerial surveillance, blind the Bastion P radar, and lock the air corridor with a 24-48-hour NOTAM. The NASAMS batteries in Norway and Latvia and the Spider batteries in Estonia are already visible to each other in the joint air picture. The first element to make a difference in the initial hours will be the pair of F-35As in Branowo, Poland. 15 minutes after takeoff, they will reach the Kaliningrad airspace and launch standoff jammers at the A-50 AWACS radar's data link channel, while Swedish Gripen E fighters simultaneously flood S-400 command vehicles with electronic smoke. If this blinding phase of sensory deprivation succeeds, NATO's artillery rocket component will transition to a 4-pronged connection severance phase. Tomahawk CP Block 4 missiles from the Typhoon coastal battery will strike the Baltisk pier, locking Russian ships in the harbour. SM-6 land variants launched from Gotland will target Boyan M platforms equipped with Caliber NK missiles. At the same time, the Lithuania-Poland railway line adapter stations will be converted to NATO standard width, allowing heavy armoured trains to move directly to the Vilnius area. If the scenario includes disconnecting the Baltic power grid's BRELL ring, known as grid divorce, Kaliningrad's generator load doubles in a day, and fuel reserves deplete rapidly. The garrison's food and fuel stockpiles are already at 14 days. With land connections cut off and the port locked, a crisis begins within a week. Donohue's emphasis on hours highlights the operational criticality of the first 24-48 hours. If the blindfold and communication disruptions succeed, The third phase, the siege plan, is activated. Poland's 15th Mechanized Brigade crosses the Nemunas River via portable bridges and collapses on the southeastern front of the exclave. The Lithuanian Iron Wolf Brigade moves south from the Kalvaria sector, closing the corridor in the Baltic forest belt, which is difficult to maneuver. Estonian drone artillery reconnaissance teams detect Russian armored exit attempts before their engines even warm up, using a real-time visual coordinate cycle. As soon as NATO establishes ground control, it closes the airspace to civilian traffic for 96 hours and declares a full no-fly zone. In a 2016 Baltic simulation report, RAND stated that NATO cannot defend the Riga-Vilnius corridor within 6 days. In 2025, the same institution ran a new scenario and reached a different conclusion. With coordinated Polish-Lithuanian pressure and F-35 network coverage, the Kaliningrad garrison will enter a munitions-fueled bottleneck within 10 days. The emphasis on speed refers to the bottleneck being reached before that point. Increased NATO pressure on Kaliningrad and the hardening of deterrence along the Baltic front have brought the Kremlin to one of its most strategically fragile turning points. Although the official doctrine clearly states that the loss of Russian territory is a nuclear response threshold, when this theoretical threshold is translated into practice, Moscow faces two critical breaks. Russia still has to rely on the strategic triad that balances the US-UK-France nuclear triad. A tactical nuclear strike on NATO territory would mobilize not only the Baltic region, but the entire alliance under a single command, as required by Article 5. This would open an unpredictable front for Moscow. The US's nuclear infrastructure in Europe would be immediately brought to operational status. The independent nuclear capabilities of Britain and France would serve as the second and third layers of deterrence. NATO's extraordinary mobilization would corner Russia not only in Ukraine, but on every front from the Black Sea to the Arctic. Moreover, even the threat of a nuclear move would leave Russia facing economic, diplomatic, and cyber retaliation. Pressure from critical trading partners, such as the G7, China, and India, would also intensify in this scenario. It is therefore not surprising that the Kremlin would hesitate to maintain even bluff-level nuclear threats. Kaliningrad is known as one of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons depots. However, the detonation of a warhead there would directly affect Russian settlements. Any nuclear explosion would not only endanger NATO targets, but also Russia's own territory and civilian infrastructure. The image of a nuclear flash on its own soil, created by such a scenario, would make it impossible for the Kremlin to control public opinion at home. The power of propaganda would suffer a serious blow, and a wave of panic and distrust would sweep across the Russian people. For this reason, Moscow's first reflex will not be nuclear weapons. Instead, the Kremlin will turn to more flexible, deniable, and hybrid methods that will delay international response. The hybrid elements that the Kremlin is expected to deploy in the coming period may include the following: creating internal instability by using the green men tactic, particularly among the Russian-speaking population in Latvia and Estonia. Sabotage attempts on the Vilnius-Warsaw railway line or Baltic ports. Cyber attacks targeting air traffic control systems in Germany could disrupt civilian and military logistics flows across Europe. Allegations of sabotage against energy cables off the coast of Norway or attacks on North Sea pipelines threaten the energy security of NATO countries. Due to these hybrid threats, the European Union has accelerated the implementation of the Joint Cyber Defence Fund it decided to establish in 2024. This fund will be used to both prevent cyber attacks and enhance the security of critical infrastructure. NATO has also expanded its Cyber Defence Excellence Centre network in Riga, the capital of Estonia, in line with this approach. Here, cyber exercises specific to the Baltic region are being conducted, and simulations are being prepared for attack scenarios targeting energy lines and railway systems. One of the Kremlin's most important tools in 2022 to bring Europe to its knees was energy blackmail. It aimed to put Baltic and Central European countries under economic and social pressure during the winter months by reducing natural gas flows. However, today, by 2025, the deterrent effect of this card has largely faded. Europe's energy architecture has been rebuilt in response to this threat, and Moscow-centric gas dependency is now nearly zero. Poland's Świnoujście LNG terminal has been operating at 100% capacity since the end of 2023, supplying liquefied natural gas from Norway and the US to both its domestic market and the Baltic region. Lithuania's Klaipėda floating LNG terminal has reached the capacity to meet the gas needs of the entire Baltic trio, including Latvia and Estonia. Thus, gas from Russia has been completely phased out for the Baltic countries. At the same time, interconnections such as the Estonia-Finland-Baltic connector have made energy sharing more resilient. The sabotage attacks in 2022 rendered Nord Stream 1 and 2 effectively inoperable. Germany's direct connection to gas from Russia has been severed, replaced by US LNG, Norwegian pipelines, and spot gas trade linked to Belgium, France. Berlin's energy security is no longer directly dependent on Moscow's whims. Moscow could still attempt to disrupt gas prices by threatening sabotage against energy infrastructure off the coast of Norway. However, this would only have a short-term impact. Long-term LNG contracts with the US provide the flexibility needed to offset sudden price spikes in the market. The EU's new gas price cap mechanism and joint energy procurement platforms are limiting price volatility. New undersea surveillance networks off the coasts of Norway and Denmark have reached the capacity to detect and prevent sabotage attempts early on. Today, the Kremlin has no cards left to play to discipline the Baltic countries or Central Europe with energy. The gas stick has been broken. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have secured their own winters with their own hands. The era when Russia shook Europe with winter cold has come to an end. Now Europe has become more resilient and determined, not only in terms of natural gas, but also geopolitically. The loss of the exclave will also deal an indirect but noticeable blow to Russia's front in Ukraine. The Russian Baltic fleet cannot withdraw its Caliber NK stockpile to the Black Sea, and its cruise missile range no longer reaches Poltava or Lviv. The St. Petersburg-Pskov logistics center will shift to defense, and armored vehicle shipments to Donbass will be halted. The moral aspect is even more critical. In 18 months, the bases in Belgorod, Kursk, Samara, and Saratov were struck by drone attacks. The capture of Russia's only exclave by NATO would shatter the semi-encircled fortress perception among the Russian public. The middle class in Moscow has already experienced the shock of realizing that the capital is not untouchable. If the Kaliningrad flag is lowered, the idea that the outer defense ring has collapsed will spread rapidly. Longer queues at passport offices, increased resistance to mobilization calls, and the acceleration of the ruble flight trend will become harsh realities at that moment. Belarus's role also declines. The exclave was the golden link in the strategic value chain between Russia and Belarus. If it falls, Minsk loses its buffer zone advantage and turns into a miniature state dependent on external factors in the corridor cut off by the EU from energy to railways. The Lukashenko regime loses its bargaining power under Moscow's protection. As Russia seeks to deploy more troops along the Belarus-Poland border, it leaves its St. Petersburg line vulnerable. The domino piece of the Baltic security architecture falls here. The Vilnius-Warsaw-Riga line would breathe a sigh of relief, while Königsberg would return to the dusty pages of history. In the short term, Russia would seek to compensate for the geopolitical points it lost in Kaliningrad by increasing its presence in the Black Sea. It may try to further fortify the Crimean Peninsula, deploy new air defense batteries in Sevastopol, and put pressure on Black Sea trade routes. However, NATO's deployment of maritime surveillance drones to the Romania-Turkey triangle in the Black Sea and the underwater sensor network financed by the European Initiative Fund could thwart this countermove. The Kremlin, losing ground in the geopolitical chess game following the exclave crisis, will be forced to open a new front. This scenario also carries risks for NATO. This should not be forgotten. Even if the operation goes smoothly, Russian territory will be officially occupied for the first time in Europe. The nuclear tension divide European public opinion, energy and financial markets surge again, and a hawkish, dovish split emerges against Moscow. Even if the EU Commission accelerates the idea of a joint military council, members such as Hungary may emerge with different interpretations. However, in the long term, Baltic security will remain solid. The defense perimeter around Gotland Island expands, and defense spending by the Polish army, which has blunted the Moscow threat, leads to a normalization of the defense burden sharing between Berlin and Paris, with Sweden and Finland fully integrating into NATO. In summary, Donohue's claim, limited to a matter of hours, is not rhetoric, but a subtle hint at the force that has been building on the ground. If the timing of the trio of blinding, severing connections and encirclement is right, the Kaliningrad defense system could technically evaporate. For Moscow, the loss of the exclave would mean military defeat on the external front, a moral defeat on the internal front, an economic defeat on the energy front, and geopolitical collapse in Belarus. For NATO, it offers the opportunity to permanently close the Baltic security chain, but at the same time brings the risk of escalating nuclear rhetoric. Until now, the Suwalki corridor has been referred to as a difficult-to-defend bottleneck. By the summer of 2025, the equation has turned, and the same bottleneck has become an impossible exit for Russia. The exclave is trapped, the garrison's logistical lifeline is shrinking, and the A2AD fortress is shaking like a paper door. When the Baltic countries, Poland, Germany, Sweden, Finland, Canada, and even parts of Australia unite, it is clear that NATO will not be content with holding on to a small piece of land, but will instead gain the momentum to turn the tables. What happens next depends on the Kremlin's perception threshold. Will it back down before the Baltic door closes, or will it fan the flames of risk in the cold with a "I'll break it too" bluff? The answer is not yet clear, but one thing is certain. Kaliningrad is no longer just a Soviet-era port relic. It is the steel test of Europe's security architecture. Whoever holds the key will hold the balance of power in the Baltic region. Now we ask you, if Moscow makes the mistake of launching a military adventure in the Baltic, can NATO truly isolate the fortress within hours? Or will nuclear rhetoric hit the brakes at the last moment, and the exclave become the subject of prolonged Cold War-style negotiations? Share your thoughts in the comments and let's expand the discussion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for new analyses. Thank you for watching.
The region's governor says at least 4 people were injured after what they're describing as a massive strike. That follows a possible drone attack overnight on a Russian oil refinery.
Russia is engulfed in flames. The lifelines of Russia's war machine melted away in 3 explosions on July 22 to 33, 2025. There are 3 critical pillars that give Russia its confidence in war: the chemical plants that feed its explosive production lines, the fuel refineries that keep its air and land vehicles running, and the energy and communications backbone that connects its troops behind the front lines. In the last week of July, Ukraine struck all of these pillars in quick succession. First, strikes disabled Russia's largest petrochemical complex in the Samara region, followed by a second wave that shut down a high-capacity refinery in the same city. The following night, the successive targeting of a thermal power plant, a regional railway junction, and Rostelecom's main data center in Novocherkassk made it clear that the attack was no coincidence. For Moscow, the result was not just zeros added to the fire reports, it was a chain reaction that ranged from the speed of artillery fire to the tempo of air sorties to the labels on food shelves. So how did Ukraine target these facilities, overcome Russian defenses, and cripple the Russian war machine? All 3 targets were hit by a single actor: the Ukrainian Armed Forces low-radar signature UJ-26 Boba swarm. Let's start with the chemical plant. Andrei Kovalenko, head of the Disinformation Response Center affiliated with Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, reported on Tuesday, July 22, that an attack had been carried out on a facility belonging to the Novokuybishevsk petrochemical company in Russia's Samara region. Kovalenko stated that the facility produced raw materials for explosives, including benzene, phenol, acetone, alpha-methyl styrene, synthetic ethyl alcohol, and paratert butyl phenol. The CPD chairman explained that these components are used in the production of TNT, hexagen, tetryl, and other types of explosives used to equip artillery shells, aircraft bombs, fragmentation munitions, and rockets. Indeed, this facility was of great importance. The Novokuybishevsk petrochemical complex, with an annual processing capacity of 1 million tons, serves as the backbone of Russia's high-explosive raw material production. Aromatic hydrocarbons such as benzene and phenol enter nitration reactors here, undergo several stages of processing, and are transformed into precursor components of TNT and RDX. These intermediates are shipped to filling lines in the Urals, where they form the explosive content of 122 and 152 mm artillery shells. The first target of the attack on the facility was the raw benzene storage tanks. The exposed flames rapidly expanded the mixture inside the pressurized pipe within seconds. Within a short time, 3 nitration towers exceeded the safe operational limit and triggered an emergency shutdown. The line was completely shut down until a water wall was established to cool the process at the facility due to the risk of leakage. Although this decision appears to have been an environmental accident prevention measure, it had a direct negative impact on the stock of explosives destined for the front line. Satellite images of the area indicate that the diameter and rise time of the initial explosions were low, suggesting low payload but highly accurate kamikaze drones. The UJ-26 bomber, which has been mentioned frequently in recent times, is a possible example of this. According to open sources, the body length is around 3 meters, with a delta-shaped wingspan of 2.5 meters. Thanks to its low infrared signature, it engages low-altitude weapons at the Pantsir level rather than the S-300. It is claimed that a GLONASS GPS hybrid module and image recognition package are combined for guidance. This allows it to select the target tower from stored reference photos without an external connection during the last 5 kilometers of its route. The real critical point is range. Targets struck more than 100 kilometers deep inside Russian territory show that the UAV took off from inside Ukraine and passed through a very wide S-300 coverage area. The reason why air defense radars cannot detect bobber is that its radar cross-section is close to that of a bird and does not produce reflections at certain wavelengths. Bobber, or a similar body, at least opened the first wave. Hours later, on the morning of July 22nd, residents of Novokuibishevsk in the Samara region reported powerful explosions. Ukraine carried out a successful attack with unmanned aerial vehicles on a Russian strategic facility. Sources reported that at least 2 UAVs reached their targets, the Novokuibishevsk oil refinery. A direct hit caused a fire at the facility. Industrial areas were engulfed in flames. The Novokuibishevsk refinery is located next to a chemical complex. The Novokuibishevsk refinery is part of Rosneft and is of key importance for oil refining in the Volga region. Among other things, it produces fuel for jet engines. It produces high-quality bitumen and RT fuel, the main type of aviation kerosene in demand by Russian military aviation. It processes 8,800,000 tons of crude oil annually and produces RT-class jet fuel for the Russian Air Force. The standout feature is not just the volume but the production process, which can be redirected to the front lines in a very short time. This means that the thousands of tons of kerosene stored here can be transported to Engels Air Base or the helicopter landing pads in Voronezh within a day if needed. The second wave heading for the refinery hit the distillation tower and the hydrocracker line. The technical team acknowledged in the first hour that operations had been shut down and cooling was expected. In short, the general shutdown meant that crude oil input had stopped and output was close to zero. As soon as the Air Command received this statement, it reduced its sortie plans on the southern and western fronts by 45%. Tanker flights had to take fuel from the eastern region, increasing both flight time and costs. The following night, in the Rostov region, was the second act of the strategic coup. On the night of July 23rd, an intense attack by unmanned aerial vehicles was carried out on Novocherkassk in the Rostov region, causing destruction and fires in the city. The railway infrastructure, a regional power plant, and a Rostelecom building were under attack. The Novocherkasskaya thermal power plant provides load balancing for both regional industry and the railway signaling network. Around midnight, Russian media reported that pieces of the allegedly downed UAVs had caused a fire in the center of Novocherkassk. According to the Russians, explosions also occurred near the Novocherkasskaya thermal power plant. The drone attack caused power outages in Novocherkassk. The attack on the Russian region began around 11:30 p.m. The Russians reported hearing at least 10 explosions in the center of the region and explosions in Novocherkassk. The first explosion occurred in the cooling tower of the Novocherkasskaya thermal power plant. Drone parts flew into the main transformers on the generator line, the load shedding system kicked in, and the lights of the city of 800,000 people went out at once. The darkness not only turned off the lights in homes, but also silenced the signaling of the southern military district stations. Trains were stuck on the tracks. 28 connecting stations on the railway network experienced a chain blockage. This disruption meant that high-speed train lines carrying ammunition and personnel to Donbass were also slowed down. The Russians also reported that one of the drones allegedly shot down in Novocherkassk around 12:20 a.m. crashed near the train station building and exploded, causing a fire at the site of the attack. In addition, it was quickly learned that an attack had been carried out on the building of Rostelecom, a Russian telecommunications company providing local and long-distance telephone services and broadband internet access in Novocherkassk. When the drones hit the cooling tower, the automation system protecting the generator's rotation triggered the circuit breakers and the entire unit was shut down. A drone targeted the train station building in Novocherkassk. As a result of the major attack, train traffic in the Rostov region was paralyzed. Stations left without electricity stopped train traffic. Freight trains carrying ammunition, food and personnel to the Eastern Front were lined up on the tracks. Oil-burning diesel locomotives still exist, but Russia relies heavily on electric traction systems, and even a delay in switching between the two means hours of lost logistics. Before the shock of this had subsided, a wave hit Rostelecom's main data center. At that moment, smoke rose from the roof of the Rostelecom data center. A drone fragment struck the HVAC units on the building's roof. When the fire suppression gas was released, the server clusters automatically shut down. All fixed lines and fiber internet in the area were cut off for nearly 4 hours. Considering that potential military lines may also pass through this backbone, a segment of the command and control network temporarily went blind. The data center's broadband service affected not only civilian users, but also military IP tunnels. When connections slowed at the command level, the artillery radar firing circuit responded with a delay of several minutes. Until the counter-battery radar was reconnected at the front, Ukrainian artillery found over 50 rapid-fire windows. While the direct technical impact of these attacks on the Russian war machine is the depletion of ammunition and fuel stocks, the indirect impact is on morale and the economy. The multiplier effect is simple. The amount of explosives that will not be produced in the 6 weeks it takes to bring a reactor tower back online is equivalent to 65,000 artillery shells on the front lines. If the refinery remains shut down for another 2 weeks, the Southern Military District's Air Command will have to cancel a third of its sorties. The Novocherkassk railway blockade means that 3,000 tons of ammunition will arrive late at the front every day, prompting even Russian generals to openly admit that they are temporarily reducing the intensity of fire. Why couldn't Russian air defense stop these 3 moves? The radar cross-section of a drone swarm is smaller than a tennis ball. When the S-300PT radar deployed on the Samara line was designed, such low RCS values were classified as flocks of birds and required filtering. The system did just that, ignoring low-speed, low-profile targets. The Panzer S-1s, on the other hand, wait for target information from the upper radar based on a see, reveal, shoot logic. When the target is not marked, it is difficult to hunt small drones in the dark of night with their own optics. GMLRS rockets follow a low, flat ballistic trajectory and cut very few radar lines before reaching their target. The second vulnerability was that the batteries had been moved to defend Crimea and Moscow. The Samara region was considered to be in the rear and had no modern S-400s. Russian commanders believed that Novokuybishevsk was strategic but safe. The attack wiped out that belief overnight. 3 locations, 3 devastating effects. So what is the total material damage? The cost of repairing the chemical complex is estimated at around $300 million, based on comparable cases. The body of the nitration tower, heat exchangers, process control unit, all of this is Western-made equipment. Under sanctions, it is almost impossible to find identical parts. There are Chinese equivalents, but they do not have the necessary certification for use in explosive chemical processes. The estimated damage to the refinery is $500 million. There is no insurance payout because Western reinsurance companies no longer cover Russian energy assets. The average cost of repairing a reactor unit at the Novocherkasskaya thermal power plant is $80 million. The server rack in the Rostelecom building is worth $25 million. Railway car losses, track repairs and shipping delays amount to approximately $40 million. In just 2 nights, the total direct damage amounts to $945 million. This is approximately 3 times the average daily expenditure of Russia's 2025 defense budget. Direct damage is just the visible part of the problem. More importantly, there is a multiplier effect. Delays in filling chemical shortages will lead to inflation in artillery gunpowder. Russian artillery units were firing 10,000 rounds per day in November 2023. By early July 2025, this number had dropped to around 4,500. If the Samara loss officially enters the tables, the firing rate will drop to 3,000. Infantry advances will become difficult on a front where artillery is silent. The Russian army has already resorted to a gradual millimeter tactic on the Avdiivka line. Fuel shortages will similarly reduce air sorties. Su-34 bombers and K-52 helicopters were the front line's aerial artillery, operating at an average of 80 sorties per day. A 40 to 50% reduction in air fuel supplies would severely impact their operations. This would also hit the economy hard. When the refinery was shut down, the price of a litre of diesel fuel for civilians rose by 6 rubles, and truck transportation costs immediately increased by 3%. This increase is reflected in food logistics. The price of bread is seemingly small, but it is the first item that the public feels. Food inflation has already been 45% since the beginning of the year. Now that means an additional 2–3%. Rostat's previous crisis scenario considers 50% to be the psychological threshold. If that barrier is crossed, the wage price spiral will accelerate. The central bank raised its policy rate to 21% last month. After the food shock, there is talk of 23–24%. High interest rates will destroy small businesses and increase job losses. Morale on the streets is even more critical. While Moscow television broadcasts victory packages every night, a chemical plant is burning in the heart of Samara, and Rostov's energy grid is collapsing. Despite social media censorship, images are circulating via VPN. The crowd that said, "The war won't come to us," has now seen the nightlight go out. Interior Ministry data shows that passport renewal applications have increased by 60% in just 2 weeks. High-income tech workers, doctors, and engineers are making new emigration plans. Brain drain adds a long-term growth loss bill to the war's costs. This bill will be more lasting than the ruble's current devaluation. There is also turmoil on the international front. Upon hearing news of the petrochemical refinery fire, the Brent market deemed Russia's Volga supplies risky, and prices jumped by $2. EU importers want an additional premium for the Moscow risk. Asian buyers, particularly India and China, are already trying to secure the Urals basket at even lower prices. Russia's profit margins are narrowing. The budget, which has lost 38% of its oil revenue, will feel the foreign exchange deficit this winter if it cannot secure concessions on the OPEC Plus quota. China is using this opportunity to offer further discounts and longer-term supply conditions. Moscow is forced to pin its geopolitical lifeline on Beijing's goodwill. The Kremlin could respond to this situation in 2 ways. The first option is to surround Russia's economic and military infrastructure, strategic targets such as petrochemical plants, refineries, power plants, railway junctions, and communication centers, with air defense systems. This means establishing a multi-layered defense network with S-400 long-range batteries and Pantsir S-1 short-range hybrid systems. But this scenario poses several critical challenges. Given Russia's geographical size, the number of potential targets to be defended is in the thousands. Each facility requires at least 1 Pantsir battery and radar support, while S-400 batteries can only be assigned to large facilities. Each of these defense systems requires trained radar operators, missile technicians, and maintenance personnel. These systems cannot function without the deployment of tens of thousands of additional soldiers and specialists. Each S-400 launcher costs around $200 million. Pantsir batteries are not cheap either. A defense network of this scale requires a budget of billions of dollars. Moreover, even these expenditures do not guarantee absolute protection. Russia's land area exceeds 17 million square kilometers. Armoring every facility in a country of this size is logistically and geographically impossible. The enemy would not only find an opening, but would also determine where to strike. The second option is a method that the Kremlin often resorts to as a reflex: long-range rocket attacks on Ukrainian cities and energy infrastructure. This is a suppression and intimidation tactic left over from the Soviet era. The logic is simple. You hit my facility, I'll leave Kiev without electricity. But the sustainability of this strategy has also begun to be questioned. High-precision missile systems such as Iskander-M, KH-101, and Kalibr are already in limited supply. As of mid-2025, more than 50% of their stockpiles have been depleted. The shutdown of the petrochemical plant in Samara is disrupting the filling process for TNT, hexogen, and other explosives used in these missiles. In other words, even if the Kremlin wanted to launch a revenge rocket, it may not have any payload to put in it. In other words, If you cannot protect the facility, you cannot retaliate. Without a center for producing explosives, the missiles will be empty. The message of this new approach is clear and straightforward for Ukraine. Shutting down a chemical reactor has a more lasting and strategic impact than silencing an artillery battery. If the refinery burns down, jet fuel runs out and planes can't fly. If the petrochemical plant is hit, the production of high explosives like TNT and hexogen stops, and rocket warheads remain empty. If a power plant goes offline, command centers that operate radar systems and missile launchers are left without electricity. Where does this process lead? The chemical tower may be repaired, the refinery chimney may start smoking again, and the power grid may be reconnected. But this time, the layer of trust that has been pierced will not close as before. Because in modern warfare, striking the source of explosives is equivalent to breaking the front line. Ukraine's hybrid drone rocket concept has proven this. The Kremlin also knows that a second Samara and a third Novocherkassk are definitely waiting somewhere on the list. If the defense line fails, Russia will not only count bullets, but also begin to monitor the pulse of its economy. Now the question is for you. Do you think the Kremlin can quickly build a deep internal defense shell to prevent the next attack, or will it, as many experts predict, be forced to seek support from China and Iran in exchange for greater concessions? Share your thoughts in the comments, because in this struggle, it's not just rockets that are exploding. The nuances of strategy are also making a loud noise. Thank you for watching.
The European Union's 18th sanctions package against Russia has moved beyond the draft stage and is now being finalized down to the last comma on the desks of member capitals. It has become clear that Brussels is witnessing an economic blockade of unprecedented scale and depth in its history. The gradual restrictions that began with the annexation of Crimea in 2014 had hardened into an oil embargo, technology controls, financial blockades, and price caps following the full-scale invasion of 2022. However, the new blow to the energy lifeline, combined with the double clamp on banking communications and the port ban leaving the shadow fleet uninsured, has brought us to a turning point where the foreign exchange taps feeding the Kremlin's war machine will be shut off to the bone. Brussels' diplomatic records indicate that the package includes freezing all payments related to engineering, maintenance, decommissioning, and even environmental liability insurance for the Nord Stream 1-2 pipelines. They also included elements such as lowering the $60 per barrel cap on Russian oil to $45, and banning a total of 419 ships, including 77 newly built tankers, from entering EU waters, financial and insurance pools, and port infrastructure. It was also mentioned that the interest income from Russia's frozen reserves would be transferred to the Ukraine Reconstruction Fund, effectively halting the financial pumping of the war through Russian assets. Now we will take a closer look at how the EU's new sanctions package against Russia will affect Putin and his country. Before we begin, please subscribe to our channel, like our videos, and turn on notifications. First, let's recall the previous restrictions that preceded the new sanctions package. In the first 17 packages, technology export controls reduced the flow of semiconductors, CNC machines, and avionics components by 90%. The number of banks removed from SWIFT increased from 7 to 13. The number of individuals and companies added to the blacklist rose from 1,440 to 2,250, and Russian-flagged ships docking at ports were banned from unloading cargo except for grain and fertilizer. Additionally, Russia's industrial software updates have been halted. Aviation spare parts supply has been reduced to zero, and the depletion of spare engines, tires, and electronic components in Russia's civil aviation sector has left a third of Aeroflot's fleet grounded. Due to chip restrictions, Uralvagonzavod could no longer obtain Soviet-era turret computers. Now the financial noose has tightened further, cutting off 22 banks that continue to operate through convoluted correspondent accounts via Belgrade, Bishkek, Dubai, making the ruble dependent on internal reserve funds. This is because the EU's new legal framework is deterring Moscow from conducting euro transactions with third-country banks by threatening to freeze their assets. The contraction in the energy sector is even more dramatic. A $45 price cap will deepen Russia's discount on Urals, crude double-tanker freight rates due to an uninsured shadow fleet, and push actual sales revenue below the critical threshold of $50 for budget balance, leaving the federal treasury facing reserve depletion. If Brent prices hover between $55 and $60 amid fears of a recession, Russian oil will be sold at $35 to $40, causing the liquid assets of the National Welfare Fund, which has been eroding at a rate of 3% to 4% annually for 3 consecutive years, to drop below $10 billion by mid-2026. The Finance Ministry will already be forced to pay interest rates close to 15% in the domestic bond market, where it has issued bonds. While banking restrictions dealt a blow to the war economy, technology restrictions made machines from Silicon Valley, ASML, Tokyo Electron, and Atlas Copco inaccessible, and even parallel imports via China were caught up in chip embargo rules, leaving Russian microelectronics companies unable to produce their own architecture. The EU's new package includes an additional technology clause that adds dual-use components, such as gas turbine control units, automotive ECUs, drone gyroscopes, and inertial measurement units, IMUs, to a broadly defined customs tariff code, effectively closing the Belarus-Kazakhstan transit routes. The Eurostat protocol, which detected that laser cutting machines declared from Germany to Kazakhstan for temporary storage were actually being transferred to Russia, is now revoking those storage permits. Domestically, this pressure will create a black hole in Putin's fiscal equation, which has already pushed military spending to a record 7% of GDP. When wage and social security payments face default risk, the Kremlin will either print rubles to keep inflation permanently in double digits, or cut spending, both of which will undermine war capacity. Meanwhile, the new sanctions package is likely to anger Russians considerably.
The heart of Russia, Moscow, was plunged into darkness overnight. The deafening roars piercing the sky sent shivers down the spines of civilians. Exactly 93 unmanned aerial vehicles breached the air defense system that the Kremlin had declared untouchable for years. 354 flights were cancelled, leaving thousands of passengers stranded at airports. In this video, we will not only examine the aftermath of this attack, but also delve into how Russia's aviation system collapsed, how air superiority shifted in favor of Ukraine over Moscow's skies, and the global implications of this event for civil aviation. Sit back, because this is not just a drone attack, it is the collapse of Russia's myth of invincibility in the skies. Moscow's airspace had been touted as a closed circuit for years. With S-400 batteries, Pantsir turrets, and massive radar domes, it was said that objects smaller than a few centimeters in diameter couldn't even get close to Russia's capital. But on July 19th, the city's sky awoke to a completely different scene. Days passed, but the scene remained unchanged. 93 unmanned aerial vehicles, each carrying several hundred grams of explosives in their tiny carbon fiber bodies, entered the capital's surroundings simultaneously, targeting runway lights, radar towers, and communication panels on the roofs of data centers. On that shocking night, a total of 354 scheduled flights were cancelled, and over 200 flights were diverted to emergency routes. Sheremetyevo, Vnikovo, and Domodedovo airports were placed under quarantine. Passengers waiting in the domestic terminal first heard the quarantine announcement, then saw staff rushing around in panic. The scene at all 3 airports was the same. Passport counters closed. People waiting for receipts at duty-free counters began wrapping their luggage and searching for seats. Within an hour, thousands of families loaded their backpacks onto luggage carts and sat on the carpet. Even the foldable beds distributed urgently in some areas were insufficient. The helplessness and anger of families trying to protect their children as they queued outside the restrooms were evident in their eyes. Children were given military-style camouflage blankets. These were normally kept in military emergency warehouses. In other words, a civilian infrastructure disaster scenario was being implemented for the first time. But the story is not just about people lying on the ground at airports. This was the moment that declared the most dangerous face of modern warfare. The civilian airspace, the daily lives of ordinary people, had now become a battlefield. The fact that one of the world's most heavily defended capitals, like Moscow, could be silenced so easily by drones was a complete fiasco. That night, a wave of unmanned aerial vehicles first passed over radar stations in the Tula region. They then crossed the skies of Kaluga and headed southeast toward Moscow. Drones coming from the west slightly shifted their course northward as the city lights of the capital appeared on the horizon, approaching communication cabins around Sheremetyevo. The eastern flank simultaneously circled around Vladimir and reached the southern antenna field of the Domodedovo runways. The southwestern wing carried an electronic jamming capsule originating from Tula, opened its orbit in the air, and flooded the data communication centers with ghost signals. Each of these routes was within the Russian integrated air defense layer. This means that there was either a blind spot in the radar communications chain or a shortage of personnel. The shortage of specialists is growing every month. Hundreds of thousands of young educated people have left the country out of fear of mobilization. The number of graduates from air defense schools has fallen, and the number of officers on field duty has decreased. This information is not mentioned in government statements, but becomes evident on the ground. When manual intervention is required against a drone swarm, an operator clicking on a target box on the screen could miss the drone instead of the aircraft due to a few seconds of delay. The reports from that night included the phrase, "tower communication saturation." This indicates that the system was operating beyond its capacity. For these reasons, pilots were unable to communicate with the tower. Radar systems were temporarily disabled, and a fire hazard developed on the runway. Here, we see that synchronization is prioritized over speed. These vehicles approach their targets at 100 km per hour, not 500 km per hour. However, when they all touch different points at the same second, the defense network suddenly becomes vulnerable. Thoughtful, what was the cause of this vulnerability in the defense network? Why were the much-praised Russian air defense systems insufficient? The S-400 Triumph air defense system was originally designed to target large radar signal-intensive targets. Its purpose was to act as a zone shield, capable of detecting and striking large objects such as ballistic missiles and fighter jets from 400 kilometers away. The radars used by the system operate on wide wavelengths and are primarily calibrated to detect metal surfaces the size of square meters. However, the problem is that today's carbon fiber-bodied, 20 to 25 centimeters diameter small unmanned aerial vehicles are virtually invisible to these radars. This is because such drones typically appear on radar screens as small signals resembling atmospheric interference. The S-400 theoretically has the capability to track these small targets more closely, but then larger threats, like cruise missiles, approaching from a distance could go unnoticed. In short, because the system is calibrated according to the catch the big target first logic, small UAVs arriving in swarms can bypass this filtering and reach the heart of Moscow. Pantsir S-1 was designed to catch low-altitude targets that the S-400 misses. But there are two major problems. The tracking system relies on human eyesight. It is difficult to spot small drone silhouettes at night. When 7-8 targets arrive at the same time, the operator cannot keep up. The radar has a narrow angle. It sees clearly at close range because it operates in the X-band, but it is slow when scanning drone swarms spread over a wide area. When the radar turns in one direction, the other sides are left exposed. Moreover, the Pantsir lacks advanced swarm tracking software. The automatic target classification capability found in Ukraine's TB2s is not yet available in Russian systems. This leaves the Pantsir vulnerable to swarm attacks. The issue of defensive shifts also stems from this. Since 2022, the air defense ring around Moscow has been redeployed twice. As the threat of Ukrainian-made glide bombs grew, the Kremlin withdrew some of the batteries to the Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk front lines. This reduced the density around the capital. The circular corridor of defense became weaker. The batteries that were moved were replaced by old S-300V combined divisions that had supposedly undergone repairs. But the semiconductor components of these systems are not compatible with modern mini-drone targeting logic. Moscow's defense was a fortress built on the logic of large targets, high radar signatures, and long ranges. The swarm of UAVs, like ants gnawing at a lion, blinded the radar. The Pantsir guns could not distinguish targets, hesitated to fire their expensive missiles, and the few missiles they did fire nullified the cumulative cost advantage in favor of the attacker. For many years, Russia was known as the superpower with the largest physical stockpiles, But when the cost of the war in Ukraine to the Russian army began to become clear, a terrifying picture emerged. A superpower had lost almost half of its missiles and army and was virtually crippled. What's more, it was facing an army 20 times smaller than its own. So what would happen when a superpower's missiles began to disappear? Moscow became dependent on Iranian-licensed Shahed production lines, North Korean artillery shells, and Chinese microchips. But the result was the same. For the first time in its history, Russia was forced to seek help from small countries such as North Korea. Concrete data, secret agreements, and battlefield arithmetic were clear indicators of Putin's helplessness. At the beginning of 2022, Russia had approximately 900 operational Iskander M missiles. A June 2025 Ukrainian intelligence report states that the remaining number is around 420. Ukraine's cheap drones caused hundreds of millions of dollars in losses to the Russian army, while nearly 80% of the Russian army's missile retaliations were stopped. Two main items stand out in the list of losses. Missiles consumed in the field, that is, the ammunition used in successive salvo attacks on the energy infrastructure of Kiev, Dnipro, and Odessa. Those destroyed in warehouses are stocks hit and destroyed by HIMARS, Storm Shadow, and long-range drone strikes. When the 90-kilogram GM-LRS rocket of the HIMARS ignites solid fuel blocks in warehouses, it causes a chain reaction that reduces everything within a half-kilometer radius to ashes. Open-source satellite images have confirmed two large crater-like structures near Bryansk and Belgorod. Each crater represents roughly 50 to 60 ready-to-fire rockets. A quick calculation shows that the two facilities destroyed amount to a loss of 120 missiles. These single strikes alone amount to hundreds of millions of dollars in firepower. Moreover, Russia is facing difficulties in updating its stockpiles. The critical brain of the Iskander M, which went into mass production in 2006, was powered by a US-made 32-bit microcontroller, French optical sensors, and German bearings. After February 2022, the door closed. The Russian defense industry said it would replace them with domestic substitutes, but the actual production rate fell to 60 units per year. With the war pace averaging 20 to 25 launches per month, the equation is simple. You're depleting your stockpile and can't replace it. Moscow tried to gather parts through smuggling channels. Chinese chips were sourced via Dubai, and Swiss components were brought in through Kyrgyz customs. However, the quality difference remained an issue. Thoughtful. Even Russian engineering journals admit that the domestic gyroscope plus Chinese control card combination produces a 5% deviation. This deviation means missing the target line by 25 kilometers during a 500-kilometer flight. For a strategic deterrent weapon, the label, "maybe it hits, maybe it doesn't," is a deadly loss of credibility. Moreover, Ukraine gained this image loss at a relatively low cost. By December 2024, Ukraine had developed a new attack doctrine to strike Russia behind the front lines and deployed 3 critical unmanned aerial vehicles to support this strategy. Beaver U, Rubica, and FPV swarms. Beaver U and Rubica are drones made of simple but durable composite materials, with a body cost of approximately $20,000 to $25,000. The explosive payload they carry varies between 10 and 15 kilograms. This amount is more than enough to trigger a chain explosion in an ammunition depot or fuel tank. FPV swarms are based on the concept of kamikaze drones that descend on their target in swarms rather than in individual attacks. They can fly low enough to take advantage of radar blind spots. The purpose of these drones is not to destroy a building, but to strike the first blow. When they hit areas where solid fuel blocks are stored, the result is far more devastating than a single explosion. In recent months, a Beaver U drone targeted a military base in Belgorod, Russia. The attack struck an underground configuration housing 18 Iskander M ballistic missiles. As a result of the attack, all 18 missiles were completely destroyed. A loss of approximately $200 million was incurred in a single drone attack. The base's logistical capacity and missile deployment plans were disrupted for weeks. In other words, a $25,000 drone can render a missile system worth millions of dollars useless in a single strike. Russia's missile stockpile was being used to both demoralize Ukraine and destroy its infrastructure. If this arsenal is depleted, Russia will be limited to tactical UAVs and long-range artillery systems. But these weapons cannot offer the deep strategic strike capability that missiles provide. A reduction in the constant threat of airstrikes over cities such as Kiev, Dnipro, and Lviv would allow Ukraine's economy to breathe. Factories would resume full capacity, energy infrastructure would suffer fewer outages, and public morale would strengthen. The reduction in missiles would greatly increase the effectiveness of the air defense systems provided to Ukraine. Patriot and SAMP-T batteries can easily stop a limited number of missiles, and Russia's ability to create a shock effect would be gone. At the beginning of the war, the Kremlin showcased its missile power to scare Ukraine. But as stocks dwindled, it became clear that this power was not a deterrent but a rapidly depleting resource. How did the logistical collapse hit the economy? The ruble melted 28% last year. The central bank put the brakes on by selling foreign currency, but the result was that interest rates rose to 21% as reserves dwindled. Business loans are at 30%. The manufacturing PMI plummeted to 43 points, which means contraction. The defense budget has risen to 8.6% of GDP. Every new ballistic missile means cuts to salaries, pension bonuses, and infrastructure investments for the treasury. As missile stockpiles dwindle, Vladimir Putin has rushed to 3 destinations: North Korea, Iran, and China. Starting in the final months of 2024, satellite imagery and field reports confirmed a massive munition shipment from North Korea to Russia. Millions of 122mm and 152mm artillery shells, Grad rockets, and mortar rounds were transported by train from Far Eastern ports through Siberia to the west. These munitions are not modern, and many are rusty or have low accuracy rates. But they are abundant, and even this provides a strategic advantage for the Kremlin. Russia has thus revived its artillery first, infantry later tactic, enabling it to apply intense fire pressure on Ukrainian positions and push back defensive lines on some fronts. What is truly surprising is the military dimension of this alliance, which is not limited to ammunition support. In early 2025, reliable intelligence reports revealed a striking claim, which was later confirmed by Ukrainian sources on the ground. North Korean soldiers had been deployed to support Russia in the occupied territories of Ukraine. The exact roles of these soldiers are still unclear. Some reports suggest that they are providing engineering and logistical support, while others claim that they are being used as secondary combat units on the front lines. But whatever the case, the presence of soldiers wearing North Korean uniforms on European soil represents a major shift in the international balance of power. They are obtaining significant amounts of cash by emptying their warehouses of old ammunition. They are securing food, energy, and industrial products from Russia. Most importantly, they are facilitating technology transfer for their own ballistic missile and nuclear programs.
Were launched toward the capital and the surrounding areas of Zeleningrad, Goluboye village, and the Kaluga region. The sound of explosions echoed in Zeleningrad, only 37 kilometers from the center of Moscow. Burning vehicles, streets turned into balls of fire, and sirens piercing the sky. The night turned into a war movie scene for the Russian capital, but this was not just a crisis in the sky. In the Kaluga region, where the drones caused the explosions, locals reported that air defense systems were actively working. But even though missile trails lit up the sky, Russia's defenses weren't enough this time. For decades, Moscow stood as a symbol of invincibility, a modern fortress isolated from the consequences of the wars fought in its name. This week, that illusion was shattered. Russian officials claimed to have shot down 142 unmanned aerial vehicles across the country. The ministry said 27 of them belonged to the Moscow Oblast. However, images from the ground painted a very different picture. There was damage, panic was widespread, and the system was not functioning. Immediately following the attacks, flights were suspended at 4 major airports around the capital. Between July 19th and 20th, a total of 134 civilian aircraft were forced to change their routes due to air alerts alone. Passengers sleeping on the terminal floors, those who missed their connections, those who lost their luggage, and most importantly, thousands of people who did not feel safe. The details were astonishing. On the morning of the 4th night, the State Aviation Agency was forced to issue a 3-line statement to the public. Flight routes have been reorganized for the safety of passengers. Is this the real number? Civil aviation tracking systems reported that 134 passenger planes changed their routes. 78 diverted from Sheremetyevo to other airports. 45 were forced to land in St. Petersburg without landing at Vnukovo. 8 Domodedovo departures were delayed, and 3 foreign charter flights waited for flight permission for nearly 20 hours on the Zhukovsky runway. The Moscow sky was not filled with plane crashes, but with panic. Thousands of passengers sleeping in terminal seats. Aeroflot officials updating lost baggage lists. Russian tourist groups missing their Istanbul transfer and seeing their dreams of sunbathing in Bodrum melt away. The whirring of drone engines actually cut the wires of Sharik, Russia's global air artery, before reaching the Kremlin walls. As flight routes were disrupted, the rails were also shaken. The railway line stretching from Moscow to Rostov and then to Sochi is the lifeline of the Southern Front's logistics. Over 130 trains set new delay records due to signal lines cut by drone attacks. Some were delayed by 33 minutes, others by 15 hours. A signalman at Likaya station was injured by shrapnel. A single electronic box on the track multiplied the waiting time for dozens of train cars filled with ammunition, food containers, and oil tankers. Russian railways added water service to its list of delays, and plastic bottles were distributed to passengers waiting in foggy station halls. But was the water enough? When the power outage shut down station air conditioners, the summer heat felt 3 times as intense as in Moscow. The physical heat of war transformed into a suffocating humidity that made the iron structures sweat. The economic toll was even more striking. Overnight, 134 route changes, flight taxes, ground services, and fuel costs added up to nearly 1.4 billion rubles in losses for civil aviation. Railway delays, meanwhile, resulted in 280,000 tons of ore unable to be transported, equating to an additional $500 million rubles in costs. Insurance premiums. The London reinsurance market imposed an 18% risk surcharge on cargo policies originating from Moscow airports within 72 hours. This means that imported goods such as phones, car parts, baby diapers, and Swiss chocolate will all see a new price hike on store shelves. The central bank sold large amounts of foreign currency the morning after the explosions to stabilize the ruble. If the daily pace reaches $150 million, an annual reserve depletion of $35 billion should come as no surprise. The invisible cost of the economic bill is brain drain. A quick survey conducted by the Levada Center 3 days after the explosions showed that the percentage of those who said the war has negatively affected my life jumped from 38% to 52% in just 1 month. Among those aged 18 and 35 with passports, 22% answered that they wanted to emigrate permanently, a figure that matches the record set during the 1998 ruble crisis. The destinations are Georgia, Kazakhstan, Serbia, and Turkey's coastal cities. It seems that the thunder is closing suitcases shut tight. The most valuable capital, young, multilingual, university-educated brains, are loading their suitcases and heading for the border as flames rise from the airport runway. The fear felt on the streets is real. Although Kremlin-friendly television stations put calm presenters on screen and repeat that Moscow is safe, videos of burning car parks on Telegram are being shared on WhatsApp groups. An apartment resident cannot find a taxi to return home because of the sound of sirens overhead. A babushka who has brought her 5-year-old granddaughter down to the hallway whispers, "The Nazis couldn't get to Leningrad back then. How are they getting here now?" At that moment, the first cracks appear in the propaganda. If the army can't protect the capital, what village will it defend? Economists say that Russia is being hit at a cost of about $1,000 per drone, but a defense missile costs $300,000. The opposite is true. The aggressor is playing for pennies while the defender is losing millions. What's more, every civilian flight that explodes burns tourism revenue, business travel, and cargo income. Is St. Petersburg's Pulkovo Airport Happy with the wave of emergency diversions? It may be selling fuel in the short term, but the domestic flight network is entering a syndrome of voluntary division overnight. Business traffic out of Moscow is inflating domestic prices, and the middle class is saying, "I can't afford plane tickets, I'll rent a car." Lukoil's domestic pump prices are rising as fast as the explosions on the Moscow ring road. The Ukrainian side is smiling as it watches the military cost Hulk benefit table. Independent analyst Pavel Narozhny summarized the situation in an interview in Kyiv. Drones costing hundreds of thousands of dollars each are causing Russia billions of rubles in shocks every time. Moreover, they're not even passing on the cost of the artillery shells being fired at the front lines to us. Because Russia's domestic market is dependent on a single point, Moscow. As the capital's alarm sirens wail, it's not just the political elite's high-rise residences that tremble. The entire economy's lifeline shakes. In days when the state budget allocates 10 trillion rubles annually to defense, the collapse of airport revenues, railway freight losses, the collapse of tourism, and the rapid depletion of foreign currency reserves needed to prop up the ruble all come into play. The sharpest fracture is the perception that no place is safe. When Belgorod was hit in 2022, Moscow residents shrugged it off. When the Crimean Bridge was blown up in 2023, vacation plans were disrupted. When the oil field in Bryansk caught fire in 2024, the issue cooled off after 3 days. But in 2025, if a fireball is seen 37 kilometers away, that distance is now as close as the living room and kitchen in your home. The birth rate in Russia fell by 5% in the first half of 2025, and young couples are debating whether to have children in this atmosphere. In real estate ads, the label personal shelter in a gated community outside Podmoskovia is now in the same price range as luxury housing in central Moscow. The perception of security is turning square meter prices upside down. And the Kremlin? The propaganda machine still says everything is under control. But the grayish beads of sweat on the face of the military spokesman appearing on screen are caught by the camera. Trust reports indicate that the percentage of people who trust the central government has dropped from 63% to 47% in 4 days. The math of the statistical game is clear. A 16% decline translates to 2 million people in the capital's population of 10 million. 2 million skeptics are enough to breach the threshold for street protests in an economic crisis scenario. Ukraine's drone strategy is psychological warfare on top of military chaos. 3 kilograms of explosives create panic on social media for 3 million people. When the airport's giant runway lights go out, it's not just the planes that are grounded, but the country's self-confidence as well. As the question, why did the S-400 fail, remains unanswered in Russian military blogs, the propaganda for voluntary mobilization is fading. Contract soldiers who were supposed to be sent to the Belgorod front are walking away from the signing table, fearing that if there is no guarantee even in the capital, I will become a human shield at the front. The Kremlin's pool of human resources is shrinking, but the economic losses are not over yet. As the central bank sells foreign currency to defend the ruble, reserves are dwindling and inflationary expectations are rising. The oil discount income hidden from the public is compounded by losses in cargo, tourism, aviation, and insurance. When Moscow's financial heart suffers a heart attack, news of the blockage reaches Russia's most remote regions. Retail chains in Siberia attribute empty shelves to logistical delays, but in reality, container shipments are stuck on the railways, forcing price tags to be changed. So, how is Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin unable to protect the capital? In fact, Moscow and its surrounding central region have always been the most heavily defended areas in Russia. The protection of the capital and central district is carried out by the 1st Air and Missile Defense Army. The capital's air and missile defense system has a complex structure consisting of 2 layers. The first is the A-135 Strategic Missile Defense System. The second is the S-50M, which includes the Baikal-1 and Universal-1 automatic control systems. the S-400 and S-300 PM2 complexes, and the Pantsir anti-aircraft units. All of these are supported by various radar stations that enable the detection and guidance of defense missiles. This extensive system is primarily designed to counter air attacks, cruise missiles, and intercontinental ballistic missile warheads. However, the system's success rate against drone attacks is unclear. Protection against unmanned aerial vehicles has never been the mission of the air defense missile systems serving in the First Army. Neither the 2021 National Security Strategy nor the 2014 Russian Federation military doctrine identifies unmanned aerial vehicles as a threat to national security. The Russian Federation's concept for the development of aviation defense until 2030, dated April 2, 2019, also pays no attention to the fight against unmanned aerial vehicles. When commenting on a report on the development of Russian aviation forces in the early days of the war, the Russian Ministry of Defense stated that the modernization of Moscow's missile defense system would be completed in 2023. However, there was no mention of the threat posed by unmanned aerial vehicles. The fact that Ukraine possesses the capability and intent to attack important targets on Russian territory using unmanned aerial vehicles was already evident by last autumn. In November 2022, Russian Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev called for an increase in air defense forces in the Central Federal District, particularly to protect important facilities. Judging by the recent UAV attack in Moscow, it seems that this vulnerability was recognized too late. Lieutenant General Aitek Bijev, former Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Air Force for the Commonwealth of Independent States Joint Air Defense System, proposed establishing round-the-clock air defense duty at important strategic locations, including the Kremlin, the Defense Ministry, and the Federal Security Service headquarters. But this proposal was not accepted. According to military expert and Air Defense Forces Museum Director Yuri Knutov, this is probably due to the fact that most of Russia's air defense systems were moved closer to the Ukrainian border after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The installation of air defenses on the roofs of some Moscow buildings in January 2024 also indicated that the Russian army was experiencing a serious shortage of short-range systems. On the other hand, it turned out that the Pantsir air defense systems, also located in the capital Moscow, were largely unsuccessful in detecting low-speed and small targets, including military unmanned aerial vehicles. At the same time, these air defense systems regularly detected false targets, including large birds flying nearby. The Russian military developed plans to deploy more Tor M2s to military bases in and around Moscow. But the Tor M2 was not a perfect defense either. This system detected UAVs at distances between 9 and 15 kilometers, 5.5 and 9 miles, with at least a 70% probability. Additionally, the lowest altitude level detectable by the system was between 30 and 60 meters. In urban areas, there is a lot of interference, and the likelihood of detecting, targeting, and neutralizing such a target decreases further. The success rate of the Tor M2 in Moscow was even lower. Another important fact is that Russian air defense systems have problems defeating drones in the dark. Another challenge is that Russian air defense systems can only prevent UAV attacks at high costs. This also applies to air defense systems in Moscow. Military theorists at the Russian Defense Ministry have repeatedly pointed out the low efficiency and unreasonably high cost of defeating unmanned aerial vehicles using traditional methods. Defense is becoming more complicated because UAVs are usually made of plastic and powered by a small metal motor, which gives them a low radar signature. UAVs are difficult to hit from a distance because they fly at low speeds and low altitudes. Additionally, UAVs are easy to maneuver, allowing them to evade radar and air defense systems. Although Russia has been unable to protect its capital from such risks, Ukraine has been trying to take precautions against UAV attacks since the beginning of the war. Some of these precautions were quite striking. In particular, the emergence of anti-drone teams in St. Petersburg demonstrated the authorities' concerns and the relatively low-tech countermeasures being employed. Another precaution was to impose a complete ban. Moscow authorities completely banned drone flights in the early days of the war. It has been suggested that more technological systems will be deployed to protect the capital in the coming period. Laser and microwave weapons are being developed in Russia, but they are still a long way from being put into service. After hopes for defense slowly faded, the Russians' inability to properly protect even their capital Moscow, and the fact that modern air defense systems have still not been deployed in the city, are causing great demoralization among the city's residents. On the other hand, Ukraine's latest attack was a continuation of Russia's missile strikes on the Black Sea port city of Odessa the previous evening, revealing a continuing pattern of retaliation and counter-retaliation. Both sides are becoming increasingly dependent on drones. This is giving rise to a new style of warfare that relies on technology-driven, low-cost attacks that can penetrate deep into enemy lines. The international diplomatic landscape has also changed throughout the war. US President Donald Trump issued a stern warning to Russian President Vladimir Putin after meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte: end the war in Ukraine within 50 days, or face severe economic sanctions. This harsh threat marked a critical turning point in the global pressure on Moscow and highlighted growing frustration with the protracted war. The Kremlin responded to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's call for new peace talks through President Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov. Peskov said Russia was ready to negotiate, but insisted that Moscow's core objectives in Ukraine must first be resolved. Challenging Kiev's willingness, he said that the process depends not only on us, but also on Ukraine's readiness to sit down at the table. In response to Trump's threat, Peskov described the situation as strange and asked why Washington was pressuring Russia while accusing Ukraine of avoiding talks. Nevertheless, despite the provocative rhetoric, he acknowledged that the US still wants a peaceful solution. Peskov also said that, amid heated military tensions, diplomatic channels remain cautiously open, suggesting that a Trump-Putin meeting could eventually take place. So, how will the Kremlin respond? It will say, we are expanding our air defense ring and order new Panzer systems, but the budget for foreign exchange is shrinking. It will say, additional support for civil aviation, but it needs to dip into the treasury to subsidize the immediate increase in insurance premiums. It will announce that it has repaired the railway lines, but the next drone node has already been found. In short, while Kiev continues to spend millions of dollars on defense with cheap 3D printed parts, Moscow's budget book is filling up with black marks. Seeing this picture, ordinary Muscovites are considering two possibilities. Either Putin's administration will soon place the capital under a drone-proof dome, which is technically almost impossible, or the meaning of the war will change. From a special military operation far away to indiscriminate bombing on our doorstep. If the former does not happen, the reactions to the latter will grow. Emigration, capital flight, whispers of opposition. Is the Kremlin in panic? At least there is sweat on the surface. Russia is still a huge nuclear power, still has large oil and gas reserves. But the new face of war is hitting the economy sociology-psychology triangle. The buzzing drones in the skies over Moscow have opened microcracks in the defense pyramid that Putin calls the steel armor of the century. It is not just the smell of gunpowder seeping through the cracks, but the virus of insecurity. This virus is an epidemic that beats faster than the ruble, brings down civil aviation, derails trains, and causes brain drain statistics to skyrocket. What do you think? Will these hellish insects raining down on Moscow bring the Kremlin to the negotiating table, or will it turn up the heat even more? As the Russian economy bleeds a little more each night, how will Putin's administration suppress the unrest within the country? We look forward to your comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video.
Ух ты, ебать, урод! Вот это
Russian army's supposedly impenetrable rear lines are now riddled with explosions. In Kartsysk, east of Donetsk, a huge ammunition depot was first shaken by a single spark, then sent columns of fire into the sky in a series of endless secondary explosions. This depot, located 50 kilometers behind the front lines, was destroyed in minutes by Ukraine's precision-guided missiles, while just 1 day earlier, the communication antennas of the Russian 8th Combined Army headquarters in the center of Donetsk were dismantled by HIMARS rockets. This series of successive blows leaves artillery batteries without ammunition, armored units without fuel, and commanders without communication. As Russia loses its supply corridors behind the front lines, how much longer can its war machine remain operational? We now delve into the background of the destruction of the massive 5,000-ton Russian ammunition depot and the Russian 8th Army headquarters. On the morning of July 2nd, the Ukrainian armed forces carried out a precise strike on a critical target in the city of Kartsysk in the Donetsk region. The target was one of the largest ammunition depots in the area. The explosions, which occurred around 4:30 a.m. local time, were not merely direct hits. The subsequent chain of secondary explosions clearly revealed the presence of a large stockpile of ammunition in the depot. Within minutes of the first explosion, local residents reported hearing a series of explosions resembling an earthquake and feeling their windows shake. Satellite imagery and initial footage from open sources showed a massive column of flame rising from the center of the explosions, illuminating the dark morning sky. From time to time, sparks and flashes of explosions could be seen among the flames, suggesting that different types of ammunition were detonating one after another inside the facility. The area where the explosions occurred is located on the eastern outskirts of Kartsysk and is part of an old industrial complex that has been used by Russian military logistics for a long time. On the morning of July 2nd at 4:31 a.m., this facility found itself at the center of a 5-part ring of fire. The 19th Missile Artillery Brigade of the Ukrainian Air Force struck the target with 6 M31A1 GMLRS missiles launched from American-made M142 HIMARS launchers. The M31A1 was selected for its 90-kilometer range and 91-kilogram steel preformed warhead, designed to penetrate concrete roofs and create a shrapnel shower inside. 2 minutes before launch, electronic warfare teams working in coordination with the brigade jammed the Russian P-18 spoon-rest early warning radar in the area with saturated frequency noise, causing the Tor M2 batteries to lose their lock-on window. When the first missile struck the northwest corner of the warehouse roof, the detonators of the stacked D-20 artillery shells inside were triggered in a domino effect. This was followed by the successive explosions of Grad rocket cassettes and 220mm Uragan unguided missiles. The explosion was so powerful that the infrasonic sensors of an American civilian satellite company recorded pressure waves 800 kilometers away. Within the first 20 minutes, the flame column exceeded 50 meters. The Ukrainian General Staff stated in a brief statement at noon that the ammunition storage area in Kartsysk has been destroyed with high-precision weapons, seriously limiting the enemy's artillery capabilities along the Donetsk axis. So how did the reconnaissance targeting chain behind the precision strike work? The 73rd Special Reconnaissance Group, which had detected heavy truck traffic in the Kartsysk area since the end of April, monitored the depot for 3 weeks with mini UAVs. When thermal cameras indicated in mid-June that active cooling systems were operating inside, it was reported that the ammunition stockpile had reached a critical level. This data was cross-referenced with the European Union Surveillance Satellite, SAR-LUPE. Synthetic aperture radar confirmed intense reflections beneath the roof metal. The targeting package was finalized on the night of July 1st, and the missile brigade locked onto a 4:30 a.m. time window when wind would be low and ionospheric turbulence minimal before dawn. In the final 10 seconds before launch, the GPS drill key in the HIMARS system activated the altimeter map block, causing the M31A1 to detonate its warhead exactly 2 milliseconds after penetrating the concrete roof. Thus, the munition created the widest possible shockwave effect inside. The powder and TNT-filled cassettes in the rooms were exposed to temperatures of 250 to 300 degrees Celsius during the initial shockwaves, triggering a cook-off process. This chain reaction of spontaneous explosions was the cause of the 8-meter-high flames. Russian media reported that amateur radiation measurements were taken in the area after the explosion, but no increase in nuclear levels was detected. Thus, the absence of tactical nuclear warheads inside was confirmed. The Ukrainian side, however, estimates that the warehouse contained 220mm Uragan rocket warheads, tank heat rounds, and at least 10 containers of propellant for T-62 main battle tanks, in addition to artillery ammunition. The total TNT equivalent of this mixture could exceed 2,000 tons. In other words, the explosion released energy equivalent to approximately 10% of the Hiroshima bomb. According to local sources, the facility had been filled with a large number of Grad rocket munitions, tank shells, and artillery ammunition in recent months. The former machine factory on the eastern side of the Kartsysk industrial belt had been converted into a regional ammunition depot for the Russian Western Military Group since February 2024. According to open-source satellite imagery, the complex featured a 180-meter by 120-meter enclosed warehouse building at its center, surrounded by 12 semi-open revetments and concrete-floored loading ramps. This scale corresponds to a 5th-class regional ammunition depot under Soviet classification, meaning the depot could hold approximately 4,500 to 5,000 tons of artillery and rocket ammunition when fully loaded. Field observers reported that, starting in early March, an average of 60 trucks were unloaded here daily, most carrying 152mm artillery shells and 122mm Grad rockets. The collateral effects of the attack should not be underestimated. After the ammunition depot was reduced to ashes, the Donetsk-Ilovaisk railway line was closed for approximately 7 hours because shrapnel fragments riddled a 2-kilometer section of track. It is estimated that Russian batteries on the Donetsk front, each firing approximately 800 rounds per day, will have fired 12,000, 15,000 while in fewer rounds over a 15-day period following the loss of the Kartsysk depot. Russia's once seemingly invincible energy empire is now in ruins. Ukraine's kamikaze drones are targeting not the front lines, but the refineries that keep the Kremlin's war machine running. It's not just a few barrels. The system is collapsing. By mid-2025, 14% of Russia's total oil refining capacity will be gone. It's not burning, it's not ash, it's not working. This isn't just an energy issue, it's a shift in war doctrine. Ukraine is no longer targeting the enemy's army, it's targeting its fuel, its pace, its hope. In this video, we examine how a country with the world's largest energy resources has turned into a customer waiting in line for gasoline. It didn't start with an explosion. It started with a silent buzz, undetectable by radar, undetectable by air defenses, unaccounted for by the Kremlin security doctrine. A low-cost drone launched from hundreds of kilometers away, guided by algorithms and a war strategy developed not in a classroom but on the battlefield. It was inconspicuous. It did not carry the weight of a cruise missile or the threat of a nuclear warhead, but it carried something far more deadly for the Russian war machine: a plan. The target was not a trench, a tank, or a command center. It was a refinery, a piece of infrastructure that had long been untouchable, irrelevant to frontline tactics. But that assumption is now up in flames, because by mid-2025, Ukraine had achieved what no package of sanctions or diplomatic pressure campaign could. With individual unmanned aerial vehicles, it severed the economic arteries of the Russian Federation. 14%. No one in Moscow can deny this figure. 14% of Russia's total oil refining capacity is gone. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't temporarily shut down. It was completely destroyed. The boilers burned. The distillation towers collapsed. SCADA control systems were irreparably destroyed. This is not theoretical damage. This is a measurable disaster. Practically speaking, this means that Russia has lost approximately 40 million metric tons of refined fuel capacity from its domestic economy. This translates to the loss of approximately 1.5 million barrels of diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, and military-grade lubricants per day. For a country reliant on mechanized warfare, this is not a problem. This is a death sentence. What is even more humiliating for the Kremlin is not just the loss itself, but the manner in which the attack was carried out. These attacks were not carried out with billion-dollar bombers or hypersonic warheads. They were carried out by small, cheap, programmable machines known as unmanned aerial vehicles, which are typically launched from modified trucks, operate with digital stealth, and are made from off-the-shelf components. The cost to Ukraine for each refinery hit is estimated at tens of thousands of dollars. The cost to Russia was billions of dollars in lost products, infrastructure damage, and future market reliability. This is not sabotage. This is a calculated, scalable, and repeatable system-wide economic war. And it's working. The first signs appeared in January, with Ukraine's strike on the Ilsky refinery in Krasnodar. Flames rose. Production lines stopped. This incident was considered an isolated incident. But then Syzran, Novoshakhtinsk, and then the huge Ryazan factory were hit. The Kinev in Leningrad and the Rosneft facilities in Ryazan are also undergoing partial fire repairs, leaving the southern military logistics with no surplus supply. Since the beginning of the year, successive attacks have rendered a total of 26.5 million tons of refinery capacity inoperable. This figure corresponds to approximately 15% of Russia's domestic diesel production and 1/5 of the high-sulfur fuel oil exports destined for export. For example, in March, the surplus Urals oil that could not be sold to Europe was diverted to India, forcing an additional 330,000 barrels per day, according to Izvestia. When facilities close to Black Sea ports such as Ilsky are shut down, shipments have to be rerouted via the Ural River to the Baltic port of Primorsk. This means that freight costs rise from $2.50 per barrel to $4.10, pushing the Urals Brent price difference back to $20. As the difference grows, the rubles flowing into the budget under the government's variable export tax formula on oil decline. The Ministry of Finance closed the first half of the year with an energy revenue shortfall of 1.2 trillion rubles, and this figure is expected to deepen in the second half. The hidden cost of refinery fires is not only lost barrels, but also increased insurance premiums. Following the March attacks, several major reinsurers covering Russian energy facilities raised their per-barrel risk premiums by 18%.